He didn't say a word when he saw them. Orson Vane simply picked up the letter from his desk, the one that told him exactly where his dead brother's wife had run, folded it slowly, and smiled. Not the smile of a man relieved. The smile of a man who had been waiting, who had enjoyed the waiting. Then he opened his drawer, withdrew his leather coin purse, and began counting out money for a train ticket west. That was the moment Adeline Marlowe's fragile new life cracked right down the middle. She just didn't know it yet. She was 800 miles away, her youngest daughter burning with fever, her oldest trying not to cry, and a stranger at a ranch door who had every legal right to slam it in their faces. What would you have done? If this kind of story moves you the kind, where ordinary people are pushed to the very edge and somehow find a way to hold on, then please subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications so you never miss what's next. We tell these stories for people who know that real life is rarely simple and rarely painless. Leave a comment below with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it touches you, hit that like button before you leave. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The stagecoach had been stopped for 6 hours before anyone admitted that Henry Briggs was dying. Adeline had known it for 4. She'd watched the driver's skin turn the color of old wax somewhere around midday, watched the way his hands had stopped gripping the reins with any real authority, and started just resting on them, like a man too tired to pretend anymore. She'd said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. She wasn't a doctor. She had no medicine worth speaking of. She had $11 folded inside her left boot, 2 daughters, a single travel trunk, and a destination that was still 19 miles away by road. Wyoming in July did not care about any of that. The heat was the kind that didn't just press down on you, it got inside you. Tessa, who was 13 and had inherited her father's stubbornness about never complaining, had stopped talking around noon. She sat with her back straight and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the horizon like she was daring it to break her. Lucy, who was 8 and had inherited nothing yet because 8-year-olds are still being assembled, had fallen asleep with her head in Adeline's lap 2 hours ago and had not woken up since. That was the part that frightened Adeline more than anything else. Lucy always woke up. Lucy woke up for birds, for bumps in the road, for the sound of her older sister breathing too loudly. Lucy sleeping through 6 hours of wagon rattle and blazing heat was not sleep. That was something, and Adeline's hands were trembling slightly as she pressed them to her daughter's forehead every few minutes. Too hot. Getting hotter. When Henry Briggs finally slumped sideways off the driver's bench, and Tessa lunged forward and grabbed the reins before the horses bolted, without screaming, without hesitating, just lunged, Adeline felt 2 things at the same time. Pride so sharp it almost hurt, and a fear so complete it took up every inch of space inside her chest. They stopped the horses. They got Henry down. He was still breathing, but it was the shallow, apologetic kind of breathing that doesn't last long, and he died in the shade of the wagon about 40 minutes later with his hat over his face, and Adeline holding his hand, because no man should die without someone holding his hand, even a stranger. She didn't let herself cry, not yet. Mama. Tessa's voice was steady in a way that Adeline recognized the steadiness of someone holding something fragile and refusing to drop it. Lucy's lips are cracked. Adeline looked down. The girl was still unconscious. Her lips were white at the edges. They had half a canteen of water between them. Adeline poured nearly all of it into Lucy's mouth in slow, careful sips, tipping her daughter's head back and watching throat work even in sleep, and then she handed Tessa the rest. Tessa shook her head. You first, Tessa. Mama, you need to be able to drive. She was 13 years old. She talked like someone who had already survived a war. Adeline supposed, in certain ways, they both had. She drank the water. It wasn't enough. It was barely anything. There's a ranch, Adeline said, climbing up to the driver's bench with hands that didn't want to cooperate. She'd studied the map so many times on the train from St. Louis that she'd worn soft creases into the folds. Crowley Ranch. About 4 miles north of this road, if I'm reading it right. A man named Silas Crowley. Tessa had climbed up beside her. She was scanning the landscape with narrowed eyes, the way she'd started doing sometime in Missouri, always looking ahead, always calculating exits. You know him? I know of him. Adeline took up the reins. We've exchanged letters. The pause that followed was the kind that daughters use when they have something to say and are deciding whether to say it. Exchanged letters how? Tessa finally asked. Adeline kept her eyes on the road that was barely a road. He placed an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette for a practical frontier wife. Another pause. Longer. And you answered it. I did. Did you tell him about us? The horses moved. The sun pressed down. Lucy made a small sound in the wagon bed behind them, and Adeline's hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles went pale. I told him I was a widow, she said, household and accounting experience, that I was hard-working and did not expect comfort. Mama Tessa's voice had gone very quiet. Did you tell him about us? No, Adeline said. I did not. She heard her daughter exhale slowly through her nose. Heard the specific quality of that exhale, not judgment, not accusation. Just the sound of a 13-year-old absorbing one more difficult truth about the world she'd been born into. So we're arriving unannounced, Tessa said, at a stranger's ranch, with a dying little sister, and he doesn't know we exist. That is an accurate summary, yes. What if he turns us away? Adeline did not answer immediately, because she'd been asking herself the same for 200 miles and had not found an answer she trusted. What she had found, somewhere in Kansas, was the understanding that there was no other option. Orson Vane had made sure of that. Orson, who had been her dead husband's brother, who had helped with the funeral costs and then presented the bill in a currency that had nothing to do with money. Orson, who had started appearing in doorways, who had opinions about where the girls slept, what they wore, whether Adeline was managing the household correctly, whether perhaps she needed more help than she realized. Orson, whose hand had rested on Lucy's shoulder one evening in a way that had made every nerve in Adeline's body fire at once. She'd had the trunk packed before dawn the next morning. He won't turn us away, Adeline said, and she said it with a conviction she had absolutely no right to, the kind of conviction you manufacture out of pure desperation when the alternative is despair. Not with Lucy the way she is. Whatever else he is a man who answered an advertisement for a wife. That means he wants something. People who want something can be reasoned with. Tessa said nothing for a long time. Then, and if he's not that kind of man, then we find out what kind he is, Adeline said, and we work with that. It wasn't wisdom. It wasn't a plan. It was just the next breath, and the breath after that, which was the only strategy she'd had since the morning she'd carried Lucy out of their St. Louis house in the dark with Tessa at her heels and Henry Briggs and his stagecoach waiting at the corner. The Crowley Ranch came into view about 40 minutes later. It was not what she'd imagined. She didn't know exactly what she'd imagined, something rougher, perhaps, something that matched the spare, blunt quality of his letters. Instead, it was simply a working ranch that someone stopped caring for. The fences were solid, but the garden was dead. The cabin was structurally sound, but the porch steps had gone soft. There were chickens and a barn and 2 horses in a paddock, and the practical bones of a place that had once had someone tending it, and now didn't. There was a man coming out of the barn. He was taller than she'd expected, though she didn't know why she'd expected anything. He had the kind of build that comes from actual physical labor rather than any intention toward it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard that wasn't quite maintained. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned not to waste anything, including motion. And he stopped when he saw the stagecoach, and then he kept walking toward it, and his expression as he got closer was not welcoming, and it was not hostile. It was cautious. The face of a man bracing for information he wasn't sure he wanted. Adeline climbed down from the bench before he could say anything. Her legs were unsteady, and she locked her knees and refused to let it show. Mr. Crowley, she said, my name is Adeline Marlowe. I believe we've corresponded. He stopped about 10 feet away. His eyes moved from her to the wagon to the space behind her, where Tessa had climbed down and was standing with the particular posture of a child who has learned to make herself seem older. Then he looked at the wagon bed where Lucy lay. His voice, when it came, was low and even. Not angry yet. Just careful. You said nothing in your letters about children. I know. You said you were a widow. You said you were experienced. You did not say. His jaw shifted. 2 of them. 2, Adeline agreed. Tessa is 38. She paused. Lucy is sick. She's been unconscious for most of the last 3 hours. We've had no water since this morning, and our driver died of heat exposure about 4 miles south of here. She held his gaze. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for water. and perhaps a place for my daughter to lie still for an hour. After that, I will answer whatever questions you have, and you can make whatever decision you feel is appropriate." The silence stretched out like taffy in the heat. Silas Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the wagon again. Then he turned and walked toward the house without a word, and Adeline's heart dropped straight through the dirt beneath her boots, until he stopped at the porch and looked back. "Bring her inside," he said. "The well's around the east side. Your older girl can work the pump." He went through the door. Adeline stood in the Wyoming sun and let herself breathe for 4 full seconds. Just 4. Then she turned to Tessa, who was already moving toward Lucy, who was already doing what she'd been doing for the past 3 months, whatever came next. The inside of the cabin was dim and cooler than outside, which was not saying much, but it was enough. Silas had already pulled back the blanket on what she understood to be a spare cot, no ceremony, just efficiency. The blanket folded back, and a damp cloth appearing from somewhere, because he'd already been to the water basin, which meant he'd moved fast, despite appearing not to. Adeline filed that away. A man who moved faster than he looked like he was moving was worth paying attention to. She laid Lucy down. The girl's lashes fluttered. "Mama?" The word came out thin as paper. "I'm here." Adeline pressed the damp cloth to her forehead. "I'm right here. Are we there? We're close." It was not a lie, exactly. It was the kind of truth that needed more time to become accurate. From somewhere near the door, she heard Silas say, in a voice clearly not intended for her, too self-directed, "What in the hell have you gotten yourself into, Silas?" She didn't smile. It wasn't funny. But she understood it, and understanding a man, even a reluctant and inconvenienced one, was the first step in figuring out how to survive him. Lucy survived the night. It was not elegant. She had fever chills around midnight that woke Tessa from a dead sleep across the room, and Adeline spent 3 hours alternating damp cloths and small sips of water, and talking quietly to her daughter, the chickens she'd seen through the window, the shape of the clouds that afternoon, a story she half invented about a girl who could talk to horses. She talked because silence felt dangerous. She talked because Lucy's breathing, when it evened out, seemed to follow the rhythm of her voice. Silas appeared in the doorway around 2 in the morning. He didn't come in. He stood at the threshold with a lamp held low, and his face in that light was something she didn't have a word for. Not soft, not hard, just present. "She need a doctor?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe by morning," he nodded. "Nearest one's in Caldwell. That's 11 miles. If she's worse by morning, I'll find a way to get her there. I have a horse." He said it like it cost him something. Faster than the wagon. She looked at him across the dim room. "Thank you, Mr. Crowley." He made a sound that wasn't quite acknowledgement. Then he said, with the tone of a man stating a legal fact, "This doesn't change anything. You understand that. She gets better. We still need to have a conversation about what you did leaving those details out of your letters." "That wasn't small." "I know it wasn't," Adeline said, "and I'll answer for it. I just need her to be all right first." He stood in the doorway for another moment. His eyes moved to Lucy, not the way Orson's eyes had moved to Lucy. Nothing like that. Nothing that made Adeline's skin pull tight. Just the look of a man checking whether something was still breathing. The look of someone who had, maybe, kept vigil at a bedside before and knew the specific weight of it. Then he turned and went back down the hall. By morning, Lucy's fever had broken. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in stories, with a sudden deep breath and open eyes and everything resolved. It broke the way most things actually break, gradually, unevenly, in small surrenders. Her temperature dropped. Her color improved. She woke up and asked for water, and then asked why the ceiling was made of wood, and then fell asleep again, and this time it was real sleep, the good kind, and Adeline sat beside her and pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment, because that was the only way to keep the sound in. She heard Tessa behind her, felt her daughter's hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with her own. They stayed like that for a while without speaking. It was the first safe moment they'd had in months, and even safe was a relative term, because through the window she could hear Silas Crowley moving around outside, hear the particular sharp cadence of a man who has decided something and is working up to saying it, and she knew what was coming the same way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive. She heard his boots on the porch steps, heard them stop, then his voice, level and final, "Through the open window, missus." Marlowe, when you're ready. I think we need to talk. She straightened her spine, tucked a strand of hair back, checked that her hands had stopped shaking, because they hadn't entirely. Then she stood up, kissed Lucy's forehead, looked at Tessa, who gave her a single small nod, the nod of someone who has accepted the terms, and walked toward the door. Silas Crowley was leaning against the porch rail, with his arms crossed and his eyes already on her when she stepped outside, and the morning light showed her things the lamp hadn't, the lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with laughter, the set of his jaw, the particular way a person holds himself when they've made a decision they know is going to cost something. She's better, Adeline said before he could start, not to avoid the conversation, because it was true, and because she thought he'd want to know. Something shifted in his face. A small thing. Almost nothing. Good, he said. Then I'll say this plain, Mrs. Marlowe, because I don't know another way. You deceived me deliberately. About matters that are not small, he paused. I run a working ranch. I don't have the resources for... He stopped. Started again. I advertised for a wife, not a family. And there are reasons for that. I understand, she said. I don't think you do, he said, and his voice went quieter in a way that was somehow more serious than loud. I have had a family before. I have lost one. And I am not... He looked away for a moment at the mountains, at nothing. I am not built for that again. Adeline watched him, heard what he said, heard underneath it what he hadn't. I'm not asking you to build anything, she said carefully. I deceived you, and that was wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise. I did it because I was desperate and because I had no other option that didn't end with my daughters in Orson Vane's house. And I would make the same choice again because there is nothing on this earth I won't do to keep them safe. She held his gaze. But I am not asking you to love them. I am not asking you to feel anything. I am asking for 7 days. Give us 7 days to prove that we can be useful here. If after 7 days you still want us gone, I'll find another way. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. 7 days, he said finally, and it sounded like something being nailed shut. You work. You stay out of my business. And when the 7 days are done, we have an honest conversation about what comes next. His eyes were flat and tired, and she thought, very careful. And I mean honest. No more letters. No more letters, she agreed. He pushed off the rail and walked back toward the barn. And Adeline Marlowe turned back to face a cabin that was not hers, in a state she didn't know, with $11 in her boot, 2 daughters who needed her to not break down, and 7 days to become someone a closed-off, grief-hardened Wyoming rancher could not afford to let go. She rolled up her sleeves. She started with the dishes. The dishes were the easy part. Adeline had known that going in. Dishes required no negotiation, no explanation, no reading of another person's habits or preferences. You looked at what was dirty, you made it clean, you put it back where it belonged. It was the first honest transaction she'd had in months, and there was something almost violent in how good it felt to do a simple thing simply. The cabin told her everything Silas wouldn't. She read it the way she'd learned to read her late husband's moods, not through what was said, but through what had been allowed to accumulate. The grease built up in layers on the stovetop suggested a man who cooked because he had to, not because he cared how it tasted. The single plate, single cup, single fork by the wash basin told her he hadn't planned on company in a long time, maybe ever again. There were curtains on the windows, not the rough practical kind a bachelor would have chosen, but something lighter, a faded blue cotton that had probably been pretty once. He hadn't taken them down. That meant something. She wasn't sure what yet, but it meant something. She didn't touch the curtains. She touched everything else. By the time Silas came in from the barn at noon, the stovetop was clean, the floor had been swept, and there was a pot of something on the fire that smelled like actual food because she'd found dried beans and a smoked ham hock in the back of his larder behind 3 years of haphazard storage. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes moved around the room with the careful attention of a man checking for theft. I didn't move anything that mattered, Adeline said without turning around. The tools on the south wall, the ledger on the desk, the box on the top shelf, all exactly where they were. I cleaned around them. A pause. You noticed all that. I noticed most things. She heard him cross to the basin and wash his hands. Heard the economy of it, no splashing, no lingering. A man who washed his hands because they were dirty and for no other reason. Beans will be another hour, she said. I usually eat at 1. Then it'll be ready at 1. He didn't say thank you. She hadn't expected him to. What she hadn't expected was for him to sit down at the table, not in the chair nearest the door, which would have been the chair of a man keeping his options open, but in the chair he always sat in, the one facing the window, the one with the slight wear on the armrests that told her it was his and had been for years, as if she and her daughters were temporary weather that he'd simply decided to sit through. She decided to take that as a good sign. Tessa came in from outside with dirt on her knees and her braid half undone, carrying 3 eggs she'd apparently discovered in a nest behind the barn, with the casual satisfaction of someone who had been looking for exactly that. She set them on the counter, noticed Silas at the table, and did not change her expression or her pace. Just gave him a single nod as if they'd been sharing space for years. He looked at her with an expression Adeline couldn't quite read from the corner of her eye. Not unfriendly. Not friendly either. Like a man sizing up a horse he wasn't sure about yet. There's another nest, Tessa said to no one in particular. Behind the water trough, saw one of the hens going that direction twice. You want me to check it? Silas looked at her for a moment. How do you know which direction to check? Because she came back from that direction, both times with the same expression. Chickens don't have expressions. With respect, Mr. Crowley, you haven't been watching them close enough. The silence that followed was 2 seconds long. Then Silas made a sound that might have been the very beginning of something, except he stopped it and looked back out the window. Check the nest, he said, but don't move anything if she's sitting. I know not to disturb a brooding hen, Tessa said, not unkindly, and she went back outside. Adeline kept her face neutral and stirred the beans. The first 3 days passed the way all uncertain things pass in the close attention to small details, the constant low hum of awareness that everything was still provisional. Adeline worked. She worked with the focus of a woman who understood that her 7 days were not just 7 days, but a kind of audition she could not afford to fail, and she did not allow herself the luxury of fatigue in front of Silas Crowley. She felt it. Her back ached by evening. Her hands, which had been soft enough from St. Louis living, were cracking at the knuckles by day 2. But she showed him the results of the work, not the cost of it, because that was the only currency she had. Lucy recovered with the stubborn enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who feels she's missed something important. By day 2, she was sitting up. By day 3, she was on her feet and had opinions about the chickens which she expressed at length and with great conviction to anyone who would listen. Adeline watched Silas. The farfetched Lucy spoke to him directly. The girl had come around the corner of the barn, chattering about whether the spotted hen was lonely, and hadn't seemed to notice or care that she was directing this information at a man who had barely said 20 words total since their arrival. Silas had stopped what he was doing, looked down at her, and said, "The spotted one's not lonely. She's just mean." And Lucy had absorbed this with great seriousness and said, "How do you tell the difference?" And something had happened in his face, then not softening, not exactly, but a kind of brief suspension of whatever hardness he carried around like armor. "Mean ones pick at the others," he said. "Lonely ones stand at the edge and watch." Lucy had considered this with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice. That's very sad about the lonely ones. It's just chickens. It's still sad. He'd looked at her for a moment in the way adults sometimes look at children who have said something inconveniently true, and then he'd gone back to what he was doing. But he hadn't told her to go away. Adeline noticed. She noticed everything about him, not because she was interested in him in the way that word implies, but because in her experience, survival required accurate information, and accurate information required attention. She noticed that he was up before 4 every morning, and that by the time any of them stirred, he'd already done 2 hours of work. She noticed that he ate what she cooked without comment, but that his pace changed, less, slightly slower, in a way that suggested it was better than what he'd been eating, even if he'd die before saying so. She noticed that he checked on Lucy's cot in the night, not every night, but twice that she knew of, standing in the hall with a lamp low, just looking, and then going back. She noticed that there was a small trunk in the far corner of the main room that no one had touched. It was not dusty like everything else had been. It was clean. Whatever was in it, he tended to it. She did not go near it. On the 4th day, she found the ranch ledger. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been looking for a spare piece of cord to repair the garden gate latch, and she'd opened the wrong drawer, and there it was, a battered ledger book that fell open to the current year's accounts because it had been opened to that page so many times the spine had given up. She almost closed it. She was very nearly that respectful. But the numbers were right there, and she'd been keeping books since her father taught her at 14, and what she saw in those numbers in the first 3 seconds made her stomach drop. She closed the ledger, stood in the middle of the room with it in her hands, made herself breathe. Then she carried it to the table and sat down and went through it properly from January forward, and picture it assembled was not catastrophic, but it was close enough to catastrophic that the difference was mostly a matter of timing. The ranch was not failing from neglect or incompetence. Silas clearly knew what he was doing with the land and the animals. It was failing from the small compounding errors of a man who was good at ranching and not particularly good at numbers. He'd missed a deduction here, miscalculated feed costs there, extended credit to a supplier who hadn't been credited back. Small things. The kind of things that feel fine individually and only reveal their shape when you look at all of them together. The shape they made was, if nothing changed by winter, there would not be enough. She was still sitting at the table with the ledger when she heard boots on the porch. She considered briefly putting it away, decided against it. Silas came through the door and stopped when he saw her. She watched him process it, what she was holding, the fact that she'd clearly been through it, the expression on her face, which she was trying to make neutral, and probably wasn't entirely succeeding. She watched the muscle in his jaw go tight. "That's my private." "I know," she said. "I wasn't snooping. I was looking for cord in that drawer, and it was open." She paused. "But I read it. I want to be honest about that. I read it, and I have things I need to say, and I think you should hear them. You have no business, Mr. Crowley." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge she hadn't planned and couldn't quite take back. "In 3 days, I have cleaned this house, restocked your larder, repaired your garden gate, patched the hole in the north wall where mice were coming through, identified 2 failing fence posts on your eastern line that you may or may not have noticed, and kept my daughters out of your way as much as possible while making sure you had a hot meal at the times you prefer it. I am not asking to be thanked for any of that. I am asking for 5 minutes." He was very still. "5 minutes," she said again. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and his face was the careful closed face of a man who has learned that open faces get hurt, and he said nothing, just waited. She talked him through it, not with commentary, not with the tone of someone correcting an error, just the numbers themselves, what they meant, and what could be done differently. Most of its windows were dark. She showed him the missed deduction, the unclaimed credit, the 2 accounts that were costing him more than they were returning. She showed him what a restructured ledger would look like, and how much difference it would make by October. He listened. He didn't interrupt. At one point, he leaned forward and put his finger on a line and said, "That amount's wrong. I paid 12, not 14. And she looked, and he was right, and she marked it, and they went on. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Where did you learn this?" he finally said. "My father. And then my husband's business when he got sick. I managed the accounts for 3 years before he died." He sat with that for a moment. "And Vane? The brother-in-law?" She felt the name like a cold finger at the back of her neck. "Orson took over when my husband passed. He had the legal standing. I didn't." She kept her face even. "He had opinions about how things should be managed. Those opinions extended beyond the business." The way she said it left no room for misunderstanding and asked for no follow-up, and Silas, to his considerable credit, did not follow up. He just looked at her with that careful, measuring gaze for a moment, and then looked back at the ledger. "I can fix this," she said, not pleading, stating. "I can have your accounts properly organized by end of next week. I can show you what to watch for going forward so it doesn't happen again. That's something concrete I can give you, Mr. Crowley. And I think you know the numbers well enough to recognize that what I've shown you is real." Silence. "Then your 5 minutes are up." She started to rise. "Sit down," he said. "I didn't say I was done." She sat. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger again, with the expression of a man arguing with himself and losing. "The eastern fence posts," he said finally.
"Which one?"
"About 100 yards north of the rock pile. 2 of them. The wood's gone punky at the base, If you push on them, they'll move. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Harlan Dace's line is east, she said, because she'd been listening. She'd heard the name once, 2 days ago, when a ranch hand from somewhere had ridden by and said something she wasn't supposed to hear. Is that a problem? Something moved through his expression quickly. Too quickly for her to catch all of it. Dace has been pushing my line for 2 seasons. Claims 12 acres on the east slope are his by an old survey. They're not. His voice had gone flat in the specific way of someone who has said this many times. But a fence that moves doesn't help my argument. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He pushed back from the table and stood. I'll look at the posts this afternoon. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. Then he paused, his hand on the doorframe, his back to her. The beans last night. With the cornbread. She waited. That was better than I've eaten in about 3 years. He went out. Adeline sat at the table with the ledger and did not allow herself to feel anything dramatic about a man admitting that her cornbread was good, because that was absurd. But the thing was in the specific economy of Silas Crowley, where nothing was offered that wasn't meant. That was not a small statement. That was the closest thing to an opening she'd seen. She picked up the ledger and started working. The 5th day brought Tessa to the barn. It wasn't planned. Silas had a mare that was favoring her left foreleg, and he'd been working around it for 2 days without making progress. And Tessa's windows were dark, and Tessa had apparently been watching him through the barn slats with the focused interest she brought to anything animal-related. Adeline heard about it afterward from both of them separately, which was how she was able to piece together what actually happened versus what each of them thought had happened. What actually happened, Tessa came into the barn while Silas was examining the mare's leg, said it might be the way she's standing in the stall, she's leaning away from the back corner, and Silas had said, without looking up, "What do you know about horses?" And Tessa had said, "My father had 3. I helped shoe them when I was 10. And Silas had looked up then and looked at her for a moment and said, "Show me what you mean about the corner." And she had, and she'd been right. What Silas thought happened, a child got lucky. What Tessa thought happened, she'd been invited. Both of them were slightly wrong and slightly right, which was, Adeline was beginning to understand, the way most things worked between people who were figuring each other out. After that, Tessa spent 2 hours in the barn each afternoon. Silas hadn't invited her explicitly and hadn't told her not to come back, which Tessa, in the practical wisdom of a girl raised in an uncertain household, interpreted as permission. She was useful, and she knew how to be useful without requiring supervision or explanation. She watched first, then asked questions after the fact rather than before. Adeline suspected this was not unlike how Silas himself preferred to operate, which was perhaps why he tolerated her presence with less resistance than logic suggested he should. The 6th day was the day everything almost fell apart. Harlan Dace rode up to the ranch at mid-March on a horse that was too good for a man who made Adeline uneasy the moment she saw his face. He was the kind of man who smiled too easily and whose eyes didn't participate in the smile. And he looked at her with the particular attention of someone filing information away for use later. He talked to Silas, but he watched her. She kept her hands busy with the laundry she was hanging and kept her eyes on the task and listened to every word. Dace said he'd heard Silas had company, said it like it was amusing, said a widow woman and her girls, all the way from Missouri now, wasn't that something? Said the new fence posts looked real solid. By the way, he'd noticed them riding past. Said, and here, his voice took on the warm, interested tone of a man who is not warm or interested, but is very invested in appearing, so that he hoped everything was on the up and up, neighbor to neighbor, because it wouldn't look right, a bachelor rancher with an unmarried woman living in his house, not in a territory where people talk. Wouldn't look right at all. He was sure Silas understood. He tipped his hat to her as he rode away. Silas was very quiet for a long time after the hooves faded. "He'll talk," he said. Not to her specifically, just to the air. "I know," Adeline said. She unpinned a shirt, repinned it straighter. People like Dace always do. "The question is what the talking costs you. In this territory," he exhaled through his nose, "could cost me the Eastern Line dispute. Judge Alderman is the sort who has opinions about propriety." A pause. "If there's question about my character, about how I run my household, it gives Dace leverage he doesn't earn." She was quiet for a moment. The shirt was straight. She moved to the next one. "There's a solution," she said. She said it carefully. measuring each word before it left her mouth, because this was the most dangerous thing she'd said to him yet, and she knew it. It wouldn't be what either of us planned, but it would solve the problem cleanly. He looked at her. If we were legally married, she said, Dace has nothing. You have a wife and a family and a household that's above reproach. The Eastern Line dispute goes back to being about land and survey maps, which is what it should be about. Your character is not in question. She paused. And my daughters and I have legal standing here that no one can threaten. The silence that followed was the longest of the several long silences they'd shared, and this one had a different quality. Not the silence of a man deciding whether to be angry. The silence of a man actually weighing something. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience, he said. I'm suggesting a legal arrangement that benefits both parties practically. She met his gaze. I am not suggesting anything beyond that. I have no interest in complications that neither of us needs. You barely know me. You barely know me, she returned. We know enough. I know you check on my daughter in the night to make sure she's still breathing. You know I can fix your accounts and tell the difference between a mean chicken and a lonely one. She paused. People have built more on less. He turned away, walked 3 steps, came back. I'd want certain things clear, he said. Name them. The ranch operates as it always has. My decisions about the land are mine. I'll hear your thoughts on the accounts, but the final word is mine. He looked at her steadily. And it's not a real marriage. I want understood. Understood, she said. There are things I'd want clear as well. He raised his chin slightly, waiting. You do not speak to my daughters with contempt. You may be as distant as you need to be. I'm not asking you to be their father. But you are not cruel to them. Not ever. Her voice was level and absolutely immovable. And if Orson Vane comes when Orson Vane comes, because he will, I need to know that you will stand beside me legally. That's what I need. He studied her. You think he'll follow you here. I know he will. He's not a man who lets go of things he's decided belong to him. She didn't flinch from that. I need to know what you'll do. Silas looked at her for a long time. His jaw moved once, like he was testing something on his back teeth and finding it harder than expected. I said 7 days, he said. I meant it as 7 days and then you leave. That was the arrangement. I know, this would be a different arrangement. Yes. Another silence. Outside, one of Lucy's chickens made a loud declarative noise about something, and despite everything, despite the weight of what they were negotiating and the precariousness of the entire situation, Adeline very nearly smiled. I need to think on it, Silas said. Of course, don't he stopped. Started again. Don't start planning anything. I'm saying I need to think. I understand. He went back to the barn. She went back to the laundry. Her hands were steadier than they should have been, steadier than she deserved. And she recognized this for what it was, not courage, but the particular calm that descends when you've laid your last card on the table and there's nothing left to do but wait and see whether it's enough. Lucy came around the corner with a handful of wildflowers she'd apparently gathered from the field past the garden, yellow and small and a little wilted in the heat. She held them out to her mother with the unconscious generosity of a child who does not understand yet that some days everything is already at stake. For the table, Lucy said. Adeline took them. Thank you, baby. Mr. Crowley has more near the fence on the south side, Lucy said helpfully. Some blue ones. I didn't pick those because I thought maybe he liked them there. Adeline looked at her daughter. That was very considerate. He seems like someone who likes things where they are, Lucy said simply, and went back around the corner. Adeline stood, holding a small bunch of wilted wildflowers, and thought that her 8-year-old had 12 words described Silas Crowley more accurately than she'd managed in 6 days of careful observation. He came to her that evening after supper, while Tessa and Lucy were washing up, and she was outside in the cooling air, looking at the accounts she'd reorganized that afternoon and making notes on what still needed to be corrected. He stood beside from her rather than across from her, which she registered as a shift in something small and not nothing. I'll do it, he said. She didn't look up immediately. All right, not for you, he said. I want that clear too. She looked up then. For the ranch, he said, and because Dace has been a thorn in my side for 2 years, and I am tired of it. He paused, and because he stopped, seemed to decide something. Lucy asked me this afternoon if she could name one of the chickens. I told her they were working animals and they didn't need names. He was quiet for a moment. She said, that seems lonely for them. And I thought about that for a while, and I couldn't figure out how to argue with it. Adeline looked at him in the evening light and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have survived a lot, that this man was not doing a business transaction. He thought he was. He believed, with some conviction, that he was making a strategic decision about property rights and neighborly reputation. But the thing that had actually moved him was a small girl saying it seemed lonely for them, which meant there was something in him that the loneliness could still reach, even buried as deep as he'd put it. She didn't say any of that out loud. She had more sense. "Then we're agreed," she said. "We're agreed," he said. He went inside. She sat with the ledger in the cooling dark and looked at the columns of numbers she'd spent the week straightening, and she thought about a marriage that wasn't a marriage, and a home that wasn't hers, and a man who didn't want to want anything, and 2 daughters who deserved better than any of the options they'd been given, and she thought about a letter she was certain was already written and sealed and addressed, and somewhere between St. Louis and Wyoming, moving west on a rail line the same way they had, except with money and lawyers and Vane's particular brand of patience that was really just control wearing a gentler face. She thought about standing her ground this time. She thought about what it would cost. She added up the numbers in the ledger again, and they balanced. And she told herself that was enough for tonight. Just that one thing, balanced and true, in the middle of everything that wasn't. 3 days after Silas and Adeline married quietly at the county seat with a clerk who asked no questions they weren't ready to answer, a ranch hand named Bill, who worked the neighboring alderman property, rode past and said, "Congratulations," in a tone that suggested the news had already moved through the community, in the way all news moves through small communities quickly, imperfectly, and weighted with the specific interest people take in the lives of those who are living differently than expected. Silas nodded. Bill rode on. That evening, Silas came in for supper and sat in his chair and looked at the table that now regularly held 4 plates instead of 1, and Tessa was telling Lucy about the proper way to check a horse's hoof angle. Most of its windows were dark, and Lucy was listening with the total absorption she brought to any subject that interested her, and something in the room was different from the night before, in a way Silas couldn't have named and didn't try to. He just sat down, and Adeline put food in front of him, and Tessa handed Lucy the bread. And Lucy said something that made Tessa laugh, and it was not comfortable, and it was not settled, and nothing was resolved, and everything was still provisional. But it was not in any way that mattered empty. Silas picked up his fork. He ate. Outside, somewhere past the south fence, a meadowlark called once in the cooling evening, and the ranch that had been silent for years received the sound the way dry ground receives rain, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just absorbing it slowly into itself, making room for what had arrived. 1 week later, the letter came from St. Louis. Adeline knew what it was before she opened it. She knew from the handwriting on the envelope, too controlled, too precise, the handwriting of a man who wrote carefully because he wanted you to understand that he was in control of even the smallest things. She knew from the postmark, which was 11 days old and had made good time. She knew from the specific way her body went cold when she recognized it, the same way it had gone cold every time Orson appeared in a doorway. She opened it at the kitchen table while Silas was in the barn, and the girls were outside. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said he hoped she had arrived safely and that he bore her no ill will for leaving so abruptly, which was a lie so clean it was almost impressive. The second paragraph said he had engaged a lawyer named Elias Pruitt to help him understand his legal obligations regarding his deceased brother's daughters, and that Mr. Pruitt was confident that a petition for guardianship, given the circumstances, was entirely appropriate. The third paragraph said he would be coming to Wyoming personally to ensure that Tessa and Lucy were in a suitable environment, and that he very much looked forward to seeing them. He signed it, with affection, Orson. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her apron pocket. Then she sat at the table for approximately 60 seconds with both hands flat on the surface and her breathing very deliberate, and then she stood up and went to find Silas. He was in the barn. She stood in the doorway until he looked at her, and then she held out the letter. He read it without expression. When he finished, he looked up. "How long have you known he'd do this?" he asked. "Since before I left St. Louis," she said. I hoped distance would be enough. I knew it probably wasn't. Silas folded the letter slowly, the same way he did everything without without showing what it cost. He held it out, and she took it back. Pruitt, he said. Elias Pruitt. I've heard that name. He's expensive, Adeline said. Orson has money. That's not a surprise. His voice was flat. He turned back to what he'd been doing with a piece of tack, his hands working while he thought, and she recognized this about him. Now he processed things through his hands, through work, the way some people paced. He'll try to make you look unstable, unfit. Running off across the country with 2 children and no plan. I had a plan. He'll say you didn't. He wasn't arguing with her. He was thinking out loud, working the problem the same way he'd work a busted piece of fence. He'll say you were desperate, reckless, that you lied to get here. He paused. Which you did. I know. The judge who handles territorial custody is named Hargrove. He's out of Cheyenne, and he is not a warm man. He pulled the tack tight and checked the seam. He responds to order, stability, legal standing, things that look like a household that makes sense. We have legal standing, Adeline said. We're married. We are, Silas said. And something in the way he said, it was different from the way he'd been saying it for the past week. Not dismissive, not mechanical, just present. That's one thing. He looked at her directly. He'll try to dig through my history, too. Anyone with money and a lawyer can do that. My years right after my first wife and daughter died were not... He stopped. His jaw shifted. They were not good years, Adeline. It was the first time he'd said her name. She was almost certain he didn't notice. We knew this wasn't simple, she said. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm saying if we're going to stand our ground. He looked at her steadily. It has to be actually standing, not just legal paperwork. We need to be what we say we are, or Orson Vane is going to walk into that courtroom and take your daughters. The air between them was very still. Are you saying you want to fight him? She asked, carefully, because this was the thing she hadn't dared ask, the thing she'd been managing around since the letter arrived. I'm saying those girls eat at my table every night, Silas said. His voice was rough, with something she didn't have a name for. Tessa spent 4 hours in my barn yesterday, and she put in real work. Lucy named half the chickens, and somehow I know all the names now, because she told them to me 3 times each. He paused. Nobody's taking them to Orson Vane. He said it the way he said everything plain, unadorned, with the economy of a man who didn't offer words he didn't mean. She stood in the doorway of his barn in the Wyoming sun and felt something loosen in her chest that had been locked tight for longer than she could clearly remember, and she pressed her lips together hard, because this was not the moment for tears, and she knew it, but the muscles in her throat did what they wanted regardless. Briefly, before she got them back under control. All right, she said. All right, he said. He went back to the tack. She went back to the house. The letter from Orson Vane sat in her apron pocket like a stone. She was going to need a better plan than hope. She sat down with the ledger and a piece of blank paper and her best pen, and she began. The plan she began writing that night looked nothing like a plan by the time she'd been at it for 2 hours. It looked more like a reckoning. She wrote down everything she knew about Orson Vane in 2 columns, what he would claim and what was true. She wrote down the witnesses he might find in St. Louis, the people who had seen her pack a trunk in the dark and leave without a word, who might be persuaded by money or discomfort to describe that as erratic rather than desperate. She wrote down the things about her own history that could be made to look bad by a careful lawyer, a widow with no income, 2 children, who had answered a stranger's newspaper advertisement and then lied in her letters, and then crossed half the country on a stagecoach in July with no plan beyond arrival. She wrote it all down in her own handwriting because the only way to defend against something is to look at it directly and not flinch. Then she wrote down what she had: a legal marriage, a ranch that was now financially stable because of her work on the accounts, a community that had, slowly and without fanfare, begun to acknowledge the Crowley household as a settled thing. Silas's testimony, Tessa's testimony, the testimony of her own body, which had worked itself raw in the service of building something here. And one more thing she hadn't told Silas yet. She'd written to a woman named Clara Fitch in St. Louis, a neighbor, a friend, the wife of a shopkeeper who had watched the Vane household from close enough proximity to know things that weren't written in any letter. Clara was cautious. Clara had a husband to consider and a reputation to protect. But Clara had also been the person who'd appeared on Adeline's back step one morning, 3 months before they'd left, and said, very quietly, "I've seen things that trouble me, Adeline. I want you to know that if you ever needed someone to say what they've seen, I would." Adeline had written to Clara 6 weeks ago, before they'd even arrived at the ranch. She hadn't heard back yet. She told herself it was the mail, which was unreliable. She told herself it was nothing. She filed Clara Fitch at the back of her mind, along with all the other things she couldn't control, and she focused on the things she could. The month that followed Orson's letter was the kind of month that teaches you what people are made of. Adeline had thought she knew what she was made of. She'd thought she'd established that in St. Louis, in the year she'd managed her husband's decline and his business, and 2 young daughters simultaneously in the night she'd packed the trunk, in the July heat of a Wyoming road with a dying driver and no water. But that month showed her things about herself she hadn't known, including some things she didn't particularly like. She was impatient, more than she'd realized. She was good at looking patient, at the posture and cadence of patience, but underneath it she wanted answers, and she wanted them fast, and the waiting made her sharp at the edges in ways she had to actively manage. Silas noticed. She could tell he noticed, because he gave her a wider berth on the days when the waiting was sitting heaviest, not out of conflict avoidance, but out of the pragmatic recognition that a person who needs room needs room. She wasn't sure whether she resented this or appreciated it. She decided she appreciated it and moved on, because the alternative was a conversation she didn't have time for. She was also angrier than she'd admitted to herself. Not the productive, sharp kind of anger she could aim at a problem in use. The older, murkier kind, the kind that had been building for 2 years of watching Orson Vane stand in rooms he had no right to stand in with that careful, patient smile. She managed it. She didn't let it out where the girls could see it. But there were 2 evenings that month when she stayed outside after supper, longer than necessary, standing at the fence line and looking at the mountains until the worst of it passed. And she was aware, both times, that Silas had seen her out there and had not come to ask what was wrong. He'd just left the lamp lit in the window. She didn't mention it. He didn't either. What changed between them that month was nothing she could point to and nothing she'd planned. It happened in the gaps between more important things. It happened when Silas, without comment, began showing Tessa how to track the ranch's maintenance schedule, which posts needed checking, which hinges wore out fastest in the winter, how to know when a water line was going soft before it actually gave. He taught her the way he did everything, in small, precise pieces, with room to ask questions and no tolerance for pretending you understood when you didn't. Tessa absorbed it with the focused intensity of someone who had always known this was what they were supposed to be doing and had simply been waiting for someone to show them how. By the 3rd week, she was the one reminding Silas that the northeast corner post needed another look. He told her she had a good eye. Tessa came home and didn't tell anyone but Adeline, could see it on her face for the rest of the evening, that specific light that comes to people who have been seen accurately for the first time. It happened when Lucy had a nightmare and woke the house at 2 in the morning, and Adeline came out to find Silas already in the hall, in a state that told her he'd been awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and his own thoughts. He'd looked at Lucy, who was 8 years old, and hiccuping with the aftermath of whatever the dream had been, and he'd said gruffly, "Come on," and walked back to the kitchen and put a small pot of milk on the stove, which he had probably never done for anyone, and Lucy had sat at the table and watched him with wide, completely unself-conscious eyes, and he'd put the warm milk in front of her and sat down across the table and said, "Tell me what happened in the dream," and she had, at considerable length, and he had listened to all of it with the same attention he gave to anything he considered worth understanding. Adeline's had stood in the doorway and watched and felt something rearrange itself inside her chest, something that had been in the wrong position for a very long time. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and told herself this was still a practical arrangement, still a calculated necessity, still a thing that 2 sensible people had agreed to for the protection of land and children and legal standing, and that what she felt watching Silas Crowley heat milk for her daughter at 2 in the morning was gratitude, simple and appropriate. She was a somewhat better liar with ledger columns than with herself. Elias Pruitt arrived in the territory on a Tuesday in late September on the afternoon stage, and the news traveled the way. All news traveled in that county faster than the stage itself. By the time Silas heard it from Bill, the alderman ranch hand, who seemed to move through the valley as a kind of informal telegraph service, most of its windows were dark. Pruitt had already been to the county courthouse and pulled every public document connected to Silas Crowley that existed. Silas told Adeline that evening in the plain, factual way he delivered all difficult information. He sat across from her at the table with his coffees and said, "Pruitt's here. He was at the courthouse today. Got the land records, the marriage certificate, and according to, specifically about what I was told, he asked specifically the years between 1871 and 1873. Adeline had known this was coming and had prepared for it and was still not entirely prepared for it. The years after your wife and daughter died. Yes. What will he find?" Silas was quiet for a moment. His hands were wrapped around the coffee cup and he was looking at a point on the table between them, and she'd see him deciding something how much to say, or maybe how to say it. "I drank," he said finally. "For about a year I drank more than I should have. I got into 2 fights. One resulted in a formal complaint that's on record in the courthouse. I missed a land payment and the bank had to write me to He paused. "I was not a criminal, but I was not a man any reasonable judge would look at and say, this is a stable household." "That was 15 years ago," Adeline said. 14, and I know that. But a good lawyer can make 14 years feel like last month if the judge is inclined to listen. She thought about that. Is Hargrove inclined to listen? To Pruitt? Pruitt has argued cases in Hargrove's courtroom before. I asked around today. His jaw moved. He's won 3 of them. The silence in the kitchen was substantial. "Then we make sure our case is better than his 3 combined," Adeline said. Silas looked at her. "You make it sound straightforward. I make it sound like a problem," she said. "Problems have solutions. That's all it is." He didn't look entirely convinced, and she wasn't entirely convincing herself. But she'd found over the past months that sometimes you said the hard, true thing before you believed it, and then you worked until you caught up with the saying. She picked up her pen. "Tell me everything you remember about those 2 years," she said. "I need to know it before Pruitt does," he told her. It took a long time, and he was not comfortable doing it, not even slightly, and there were parts where his voice went completely flat in the way it did when he was holding something at a distance. She wrote it all down. She asked questions when she needed to and did not ask them when she didn't, and when he was done, she had 4 pages of notes and a clearer picture of the worst time of his life than she'd had 2 hours ago. "The fight that's on record," she said. "What started it?" He looked at the table. "Man in the saloon said something about my wife. How she died. The manner of it." She waited. "She died in childbirth," Silas said. His voice was very controlled. "The baby, too. Clara, my wife. She was 24. The man in the saloon had opinions about whether I'd gotten the doctor there fast enough." He paused. Those opinions were not shared by anyone who was actually there, but they were that man's opinions loudly held. "And you hit him. Twice. Was a complaint filed by him or by the saloon keeper?" He looked at her. "The saloon keeper. Why?" "Because the saloon keeper isn't a man with a grievance. He's a businessman who wanted order restored. That's a different kind of complaint. It's procedural, not personal. A decent lawyer can characterize that as a grief-stricken man who lost control once in a bar and never appeared in any legal record again for 14 years. She made a note. "Who was your lawyer then, when the complaint was filed?" "Didn't have one. There was no hearing. I paid a fine, and it was done. So there was no finding of fault. Just a fine. Just a fine." She wrote that down. She could feel him watching her, and she didn't look up because she was thinking, and looking up would interrupt the thinking. "The land payment you missed," she said. "Did you make it eventually?" "Next quarter. With interest. So it was late, not defaulted." "Correct." "The bank wrote twice?" "First letter to remind me, second to ask for response." "Did you respond to the second?" "Yes. With payment." She put down the pen, looked at him. "Silas. What Pruitt has on you is a grief-stricken widower who paid a fine once and was late on a land payment once, 14 years ago, and then built a working ranch from nothing and has maintained a spotless legal record ever since." She paused. "That is not the picture of an unfit household. That is the picture of a man who survived something terrible and kept going. He was quiet. It can be framed that way, she said, by the right person. And who is the right person in a territorial courtroom? She thought about it. Do you know a lawyer named Webb? Thomas Webb? I saw his name in the county directory when I looked at the land records. Webb practices in Caldwell. He's argued land disputes. Has he won any? Silas considered. Harlan Dace took him on for the property line case 2 seasons ago and lost, which means Webb argued against Dace and won. He paused. Which means Webb beat a man with money. That's who we want, Adeline said. Silas stood up, went to the window, looked out at the dark. He stayed there for a moment with his back to her, and she gave him that, gave him the space to stand at a window and look at whatever he was looking at, which was probably not the dark, but something in himself he was still deciding about. He'll ask questions about you too, Silas said. Pruitt. In court. I know. He'll ask about the letters. The deception. I know. What will you say? The truth, she said. All of it. What Orson did. What I was afraid of. Why I ran. Why I didn't tell you about the girls. She looked at the pen in her hand. I'm not going to sit in a courtroom and try to make what I did look like something other than what it was. I deceived you. I did it to protect my daughters. I'll say that plainly and let Hargrove decide what to make of it. She heard him exhale through his nose. That's a risky approach, he said. The alternative is building a story that Pruitt can pull apart piece by piece, she said. A good lawyer in front of a judge who respects order, he'll find every thread of a constructed story and unravel it. The truth doesn't unravel. She paused. It might not be enough, but it doesn't unravel. He turned from the window, looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight, with the particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was reassessing something, and wasn't entirely pleased about what the reassessment was showing him. All right, he said. All right, she said. She went back to her notes. Thomas Webb agreed to take the case on a Wednesday morning, and his first words upon hearing a complete account of the situation were not encouraging. He was a compact, precise man in his late 40s with the economical movements of someone who did not waste professional time, and he listened to everything they told him with his hands flat on his desk and his face doing nothing particular. And when they finished, he said, Pruitt is good. He's not brilliant, but he's methodical, and he doesn't make errors. You need to understand that what he's going to build is not a case against Silas Crowley. It's a case about what Tessa and Lucy Marlowe's best interests are, and he will argue that their best interests are with a blood relative of established means and stable situation rather than a mother who ran away in the night, and a stepfather whose dark years will be presented as pattern rather than episode. Can you counter that? Adeline asked. I can counter it, Webb said. But your strongest argument is not legal precedent. The girls themselves. He looked at both of them directly, Tessa especially. She's 13. A 13-year-old's testimony carries weight in territorial court more than most people expect. If she can speak clearly and hold up under cross-examination from Pruitt, it changes the character of the entire proceeding. Adeline thought about what she knew about Tessa, about the girl who had grabbed runaway reins without hesitating, who had told Silas Crowley to his face that he hadn't been watching his chickens closely enough, who had looked at Orson Vane's house one evening before they'd left and said nothing, but whose jaw had been set in a way that said everything. She can hold up, Adeline said. You need to talk to her before the hearing, Webb said. Explain what cross-examination means. Let her ask questions. Don't rehearse her testimony. Pruitt will know immediately if she's been rehearsed, and it damages her credibility. Just make sure she understands what the room will feel like. I'll talk to her. There's one more thing, Webb said. He looked at Silas, the adoption petition. Silas said nothing. Webb continued. Legally, a petition to formally adopt Tessa and Lucy Marlowe would accomplish 2 things. First, it makes you their legal father, which gives you standing in this proceeding that you currently lack as a stepfather of recent standing. Second, he paused. It changes Orson Vane's petition from a custody dispute to a challenge against an established legal parent. The bar he has to clear gets significantly higher. The room was quiet. That's a significant step, Silas said. His voice was neutral in the specific way of a man being very careful with himself. It is, Webb agreed. Adeline looked at Silas. She did not say anything. She had learned over these months that there were things Silas needed to arrive at himself, that pushing him toward a door was less effective than making sure the door was visible. She made sure the door was visible and waited. Silas looked at the desk, then out the window, then back at Webb. "What's the process?" he asked. They left Webb's office 2 hours later with a list of documents to gather and a hearing date of November the 4th, which was 5.5 weeks away. The ride back to the ranch was mostly quiet. The country around them was going gold and rust with the season turning, and the mountains to the west had taken on a quality of stone clarity that only came in October, everything stripped to its essential shape, nothing soft left. Halfway home, Silas said, "I'll need to tell the girls about the adoption petition." "Yes," Adeline said. "That should come from both of us." "Yes." He drove another mile. "Tessa's going to ask why," he said. "She asks why about everything she does." "What do I say?" Adeline looked at the mountains. She thought about what was true versus what was tactical versus what this particular man in this particular life actually meant, even when he didn't know how to say it. "I think," she said carefully, "that you say whatever is honest." He made a sound that was not agreement and not disagreement. That evening after supper, they sat the girls down. Lucy understood less than Tessa, but she understood the important part, which was that Silas wanted them to have the same last name as him. Most of its windows were dark, and this struck her as an extremely sensible development that she had perhaps been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. She looked at Silas with her direct, unguarded eyes and said, "Does that make you our papa?" Silas looked like a man who had been asked a question in a language he was still learning. "It makes me your legal father," he said. "What you call me is your business." Lucy appeared to take this under serious advisement. Then she nodded once, as if filing it, and went back to her bread. Tessa was quieter. She waited until Lucy had been excused, and then she stayed at the table and looked at Silas with the measuring look she'd brought with her from Saint. Louis, the look that had been calibrated by a year of learning not to trust easily. "This is partly for the hearing," she said. "Yes," Silas said. "Partly. What's the other part?" The silence was brief but honest. "I don't want Orson Vane anywhere near you," he said, "legally or otherwise. And I don't want that to depend on a courtroom decision about whether I'm close enough to this family to have a say." He looked at her steadily. "Is that enough of an answer?" Tessa looked at him for a long time. Long enough that it might have been uncomfortable for a man with less patience. "When you taught me about the fence posts," she said slowly, "you didn't have to do that. It wasn't useful to you to teach me. You did it because." She stopped. "Why did you do it?" His jaw shifted. "Because you were interested and you had aptitude, and it seemed wrong not to." She nodded, very slowly, like she was confirming something she'd suspected. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." She pushed back from the table and went to help Lucy with whatever Lucy was currently doing, and Silas sat alone at the table for a moment, with a look on his face that Adeline, watching from across the room, could only describe as man feeling the full weight of something he'd chosen. She thought he looked steadier for it, not lighter, just steadier. Orson Vane arrived in the territory on the 21st of October. Adeline knew because Webb sent word, and she knew before the word came because something in her woke up that morning for the animal alertness she'd developed in the last months of living in her Saint Louis house, the constant low-level awareness of where the exits were. She'd lain in bed and waited for her breathing to slow, and then gotten up and made coffee and been at the kitchen table with the lamp lit before anyone else stirred. Silas had come out at 4:30, which was his usual time, and had stopped when he saw her. "He's here," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down across from her. "All right," he said. "He'll try to see the girls. He has no legal right to see them before the hearing. He'll try anyway. Men like Orson don't wait for rights, they create situations. He'll arrive somewhere unexpectedly. He'll want to see their faces when they see his, want to know if they're afraid of him, want to know if the fear still works." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I need you to know that if he appears anywhere on this property or near the girls in town, I am not able to promise that my response will be measured." Silas looked at her across the table in the early dark. "You don't need to be measured," he said. "You need to be legal. There's a difference." He paused. "If he comes on this property, he's trespassing. I'll handle that. He's clever enough not to trespass. Then we don't give him anything to work with." His voice was flat and practical. "The girls don't go to town alone until after the hearing. You and I don't say anything in public that can be used. We live exactly as we've been living, Because what we've been building here is the only argument that matters. She looked at him. You sound like a lawyer. I sound like a man who's been in a land dispute with Harlan Dace for 2 years, he said. Teaches you something about how to hold ground. The 3 weeks between Orson's arrival and the hearing date were the longest of her life, and she had previously survived a year watching her husband die. Orson did not come to the ranch. He was too careful for that. But she saw him once, in Caldwell, when she'd gone with Silas to pick up a supply order, and the sight of him standing on the other side of the street in a good suit with his hat at the careful angle he always wore it hit her in the solar plexus like a physical thing. He saw her at the same moment, and he smiled, not the mask slip kind, not the composed kind. Something in between, something that said, I see you. I've always been able to find you. And this place you've built yourself is not as solid as you think. She felt Silas's hand close over her arm. Not pulling her, not directing her. Just there, she breathed. She looked away from Orson. She kept walking. Don't look back, Silas said quietly. She didn't. Tessa found out about the encounter that evening, not from Adeline but from Lucy, who had apparently pieced it together from tone and atmosphere with the unsettling perceptiveness of a child, whose home had been tense before and knew what the air tasted like when adults were afraid. Tessa came to find Adeline in the garden after supper, where Adeline was doing the kind of unnecessary weeding that was really just having somewhere to put her hands. Did you see him today? Tessa asked. Yes. Did he say anything? No. Tessa crouched down beside her and pulled a weed from the row. She was 13 and a half now, and there were things in her face that hadn't been there when they'd left St. Louis, a settledness, a specific kind of confidence that comes from learning real skills in a real place. But windows were dark. Adeline could the set of her mouth. Adeline could still see the girl who had pressed herself against the inside of a locked door in St. Louis and not slept. I want to testify, Tessa said. I know.
Webb, I don't mean because Webb thinks it'll help.
She looked at her mother. I mean, I want to be in that room. I want to say what I know. Because I was there, and I know what he is, and I'm tired of being afraid of him from a distance. She paused. Being afraid of him from far away is worse. At least in a room I can see him. Adeline looked at her daughter, at this person she had made and tried to protect and failed to fully protect and loved past the edge of rational measure. You'll be cross-examined, she said. Pruitt will try to make you second-guess yourself. He's good at it. I know. He'll suggest your memory is wrong, that you misunderstood what you saw, that you're saying these things because your mother told you to. I know, Tessa said again steadily. Can you hold up through that? Tessa pulled another weed and sat with it for a moment, turning it in her fingers. Last month, she said, Silas let me reset the pasture fence on the south quarter by myself. He said, I'll check your work after. He didn't help. He didn't supervise. He just let me do it and said he'd check after. She looked at the weed in her hand. I did it wrong on the first 2 posts, and I had to pull them and do them over. And then I got the rest right. And when he came and checked, he went down the whole line, and every post I'd reset correctly, he just tapped it once and moved on. Didn't say good job. Just moved on, which is how he says good job. She dropped the weed. If I can reset a fence post twice after getting it wrong and keep going, I can sit in a chair in a courtroom. Adeline looked at her daughter for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, Tessa said. She stood up, brushed off her knees, and went back inside with the efficient pragmatism of a girl who had made a decision and was done discussing it. Adeline stayed in the garden for another few minutes. The evening was going cold in the way Wyoming evenings went cold quickly, without apology, taking the light with it. She could see the lamp in the kitchen window from where she knelt, could see the shadow of Silas moving past the glass, and the smaller, rounder shadow of Lucy apparently following him with the persistence she brought to anyone she'd decided was interesting. She could see, in the particular quality of the light from that window, what a family looked like from the outside. The hearing was in 11 days. She wasn't going to pretend she wasn't afraid. The honest truth was that she had been afraid continuously since that last night in St. Louis, and the fear had not gotten smaller. It had simply been joined by other things: purpose, work, the specific weight of love that built up over months of shared mornings, and difficult evenings and small ordinary moments that added up to something to have a name for until it was nearly gone. She got up from the garden, went inside, sat down at the table with her notes for the hearing, with her careful, organized columns of what they had and what Pruitt would try to take apart. Silas came and put a cup of coffee at her elbow without being asked. She looked up. He looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. They both knew what the next 11 days would require. And they both knew that they were going to give it, and the silence between them was not empty silence. The silence of two people who have been through enough together that words are sometimes just extra weight. She went back to her notes. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. In the kitchen, Lucy said something that made Tessa laugh, a real laugh, an unguarded one, the kind that sounds like everything is normal even when nothing is. Adeline wrote faster. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and went through everything she knew, the way she'd gone through the ledger columns in those first days methodically, looking for errors, looking for gaps. She went through Pruitt's likely arguments and Webb's prepared responses. She went through her own testimony and Silas's and what she knew of Tessa's. She went through the character witnesses. Webb had assembled 3 of them, neighbors and the county clerk, who had watched Silas Crowley operate this land for a decade. Most of its windows were dark, and then she went through the things she hadn't mentioned to anyone because she didn't know if it would arrive in time. Clara Fitch's letter. She'd written again 3 weeks ago. A second letter, more specific, more urgent, asking directly, "Clara, if there is anything you have seen that would help us, I need you to send a written account to Thomas Webb, attorney in Caldwell, Wyoming, before the 1st of November." She'd sealed it and sent it and had heard nothing. November the 3rd. Tomorrow was the hearing. She lay in the dark and dealt with the possibility that Clara had not written, that they would walk into that courtroom with what they had, which was real, which was honest, which was enough, or was not enough, and the difference between those 2 outcomes would determine everything. She heard Silas in the hall, heard his boots, recognized the particular pattern of his walk. The boots stopped outside her door. A pause. Then his voice, quiet enough that the girls wouldn't hear. "You awake?" "Yes," she said. "Try to sleep," he said. "We need to be clear-headed tomorrow." She stared at the dark ceiling. "I know." Another pause. "We've done what we can," he said. "The rest is the room." "I know, Adeline." She waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, and then he stopped, and she heard him working for the words, which did not come easily to him on the best days, and she lay completely still so as not to break whatever he was constructing. "Whatever happens in that room," he started again, "I want you to know that I'm not going to stand there and watch him take them, whatever it costs. That's a promise." She pressed her lips together. The ceiling was very dark. "Get some sleep," he said. His boots moved away down the hall. She lay in the dark and felt the promise settle around her like something solid, like a fence line that would hold, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself believe that holding was possible. She still didn't sleep for a long time, but the believing helped. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of November morning that Wyoming delivered without sentiment, and Adeline was dressed and at the stove before anyone else moved, and the coffee was ready and the porridge was on, and she had her good dress on the dark green wool she'd brought from St. Louis and saved for exactly this kind of occasion, without knowing what the occasion would be, when Tessa came out of her room already dressed in her Sunday clothes, with her hair done neatly, and sat down at the table and said nothing. Adeline put coffee in front of her. Tessa looked at it. "Mama." "Yes." "I'm not scared." Adeline looked at her daughter, at 13 and a half and all that it held. "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know that." "I know," she said again. Lucy came out with her dress on inside out, and they spent 4 minutes fixing that, and Silas came in from the early chores and ate standing up because he was too wounded to sit, and nobody talked much, and the morning moved forward, the way mornings do regardless of what the day is about to hold indifferently, continuously, taking them all with it. They drove to Caldwell in the wagon in the October cold, 4 people who had arrived at each other through deception and desperation, and 7 days that had become a marriage, and months that had become something neither of them had planned, and the mountains were very clear to the west, and the road was hard with the first cold of the season, and they went to fight for the right to be what they had already, without permission, without planning, without any certainty that it would last, become. A family imperfect and battered and real. Whatever happened in that room, they went into it together. The courthouse in Caldwell was not in some trimsive building. It was 2 stories of weathered timber with a territorial seal above the door that someone had paint and someone else had let fade, and the floors inside were uneven in the way of buildings that have settled into the earth over years of hard winters. The hearing room smelled like smoke and paper, and the particular staleness of a room that held difficult things on a regular basis and absorbed them. Adeline noticed all of this in the first 30 seconds, because she noticed everything when she was frightened, which she was, in the specific contained way she'd learned to carry fear deep in the body, below the waterline, where it couldn't get into her face or her hands. Webb was already there when they arrived, standing near the front of the room with a leather case and the focused calm of a man who had prepared thoroughly enough to be genuinely settled. He shook Silas's hand. He nodded to Adeline. He looked at Tessa with a brief, assessing look and said, "How are you?" And Tessa said, "Ready." And Webb said, "Good," and moved on, which was exactly the right response. Orson Vane was already seated at the opposing table. He was wearing a better suit than anyone else in the room, which was not an accident. His lawyer, Elias Pruitt, sat beside him, a tall, spare man in his 50s, with gray at the temples and the careful, unhurried manner of someone who charged by the hour and had never found urgency necessary. Pruitt had a stack of documents before him that was organized with the precision of a man who believed that visible preparations was itself an argument. Orson looked at Adeline when she came in. He looked at her the way he always had, with that patient proprietary attention that said, "I have been waiting for you to understand that this was always going to go my way." Then his eyes moved to the girls, and something in his expression shifted, something that tried to be warmth and wasn't quite the way a copy of a painting tries to be the original, and you can't say exactly where it fails, but you know that it does. Lucy was holding Adeline's hand and did not look at Orson at all, which Adeline thought was either extremely good instinct or the mercy of a child who had mostly put that chapter away. Tessa looked at him directly briefly, with the calm measurement she brought to anything she was assessing, and then she looked away and did not look back. Adeline felt something loosen in her chest at the absence of fear in her daughter's face, or rather, at the fear clearly present and clearly not in charge. Silas put his hand briefly at the small of her back as they moved toward their table. She was not sure he even knew he'd done it. Judge Hargrove arrived at 9:05. He was a compact man in his 60s who moved as though he had been through this room too many times to find it significant, and he sat and he looked at both tables, with the same expression he would probably bring to livestock auctions and difficult weather. And he said, "We're here on the matter of Vane versus Crowley, custody, petition, and adoption review. Mr. Pruitt, your client filed first, so you'll open." Pruitt rose. He was very good. Adeline had expected him to be good, had prepared for it, and was still struck by how smoothly he assembled the picture Orson Vane, devoted uncle, man of means and settled life, a blood relative whose only concern was the welfare of two girls who had been taken from the stability they knew by a mother whose judgment had, unfortunately, been compromised by grief and perhaps desperation. He used the word desperation 3 times in his opening, each time in a slightly different register so that by the third time it had gathered weight. He mentioned the stagecoach journey. He mentioned Henry Briggs, the driver, who had died of heat exposure. He mentioned Lucy's illness upon arrival. He did not say Adeline had been reckless. He didn't need to. He simply described what had happened and let the description do the work. He mentioned the letters to Silas Crowley. He mentioned the omission of the children. He was careful to call it an omission rather than a lie, which Adeline recognized as strategy lie would generate sympathy for her, and he knew it. When Pruitt sat down, Webb rose, and his opening was shorter and more direct. A widow who had protected her daughters from an unsafe situation, who had built a functioning household and a stable family, whose daughters were healthy and thriving and legally part of an established home. He mentioned the adoption petition. He mentioned the character witnesses. He mentioned that Silas Crowley had worked this land for 17 years, without a single legal difficulty of consequence. Hargrove listened to both with the same equanimity. Then he said, "We'll proceed with witnesses," and the hearing that would determine everything began. Pruitt called his witnesses first. The first was a man from St. Louis named Garfield, who had worked with Adeline's late husband and who testified that Adeline had seemed, in the months before her departure, agitated and unpredictable, and that her decision to leave had surprised everyone who knew the family. Under Webb's cross-examination, Garfield admitted that he had not been inside the Marlowe household in the 6 months before Adeline left, had not personally witnessed anything of concern, and that his characterization of her as agitated was based on observation from social occasions where she had seemed, in his words, distracted. Webb let that sit for a moment before he moved on. The second was a woman who had lived 2 doors down from the Marlowe house, and who said she had seen Adeline packing boxes late at night on multiple occasions in the weeks before the departure. Pruitt used this to suggest erratic behavior. Webb asked her whether she had ever spoken to Adeline directly about her concerns, and she said no. Webb asked her whether Orson Vane had contacted her prior to this hearing, and she paused before saying yes. He had written to ask if she'd be willing to speak to events she had observed. Webb did not pursue this further, but let the pause do its work. The third witness was the investigator Pruitt had hired, a man named Castor, who had spent 3 weeks in Wyoming assembling information about Silas Crowley. He delivered his findings in the efficient, effectless manner of a man who dealt in facts and considered their implications someone else's department. He described the complaint from 1,872, the 2 missed land payments, and 3 months in 1,873 during which Silas Crowley had not appeared in any public record that Castor could locate. Hargrove asked what he believed accounted for those 3 months. Castor said he had been unable to determine. Pruitt said he would address that in his closing argument in a tone that made clear he intended to fill that gap with speculation, which was the precise strategy Webb had anticipated. When Webb rose for cross-examination, he asked Castor only 2 questions. First, in the 14 years since 1,873, had Silas Crowley appeared in any legal record for any negative reason? Castor said no. Second, had Crowley Ranch remained in continuous operation, in good standing with creditors and neighbors, for the entirety of those 14 years? Castor consulted his notes and said yes. Webb sat down. Pruitt rested his witness case, and Hargrove called a brief recess, and Adeline went into the hallway with her daughters and Silas, and stood near the far wall and said nothing for a moment, because she was organizing the inside of her head, which needed organizing. "He's going to argue the 3 months in testimony," Silas said quietly. "Webb knows," Adeline said. "I should have told Webb more about that period." "Silas." She kept her voice very low. "Webb knows what he needs. He'll let you explain it in your own words." Silas looked at the floor. She could see what it cost him. This exposure, the years he'd buried, being dug up by a stranger's hired investigator and laid out in a courtroom for a judge who didn't know him. It wasn't shame exactly. It was something more like violation. A private wound made public. She wanted to say something useful. She wasn't sure there was anything useful. 3 months, she said instead. 14 years ago. And every day since, you built something real. That's the fact of it. Let Webb put it in front of him. He looked at her. "All right," he said. Lucy had found a spot on the bench along the hall wall and was sitting very still, which was unusual enough that Adeline looked at her carefully. The girl's face was composed, her hands in her lap, her eyes on the middle distance. She looked, Adeline thought, much older than 8. Or maybe 8 was not as young as adults like to believe. "Luce," Tessa said quietly, and Lucy looked at her, and some silent communication moved between them that Adeline could not entirely read, the specific language of sisters who have been through things together. Then Lucy nodded once and seemed to settle into herself, and Tessa sat down beside her. They were called back in. Webb called his first character witness, a rancher named Eugene Marsh, who had worked land adjacent to Crowley's for 11 years. Marsh was a straightforward man who said straightforward things. Silas Crowley was a fair man, a careful rancher, someone who had helped him repair a dam 2 winters ago without being asked and without expecting anything back. Pruitt's cross-examination accomplished. Little Marsh was not a man who elaborated or embellished. An elaborate cross-examination tends to look aggressive against a plain, honest witness. The second character witness was the county clerk, a woman named Ruth Sauer, who had processed enough legal documents to have a fine-tuned sense of whose affairs were in order and whose weren't. She stated that the Crowley property records were entirely clean, that the marriage certificate had been filed correctly and promptly, and that the adoption petition was procedurally sound. Under cross-examination, she declined to speculate about anything beyond what the records showed, which was a quality Pruitt clearly found frustrating and Adeline found quietly magnificent. Then Webb called Silas. Silas walked to the witness chair with the deliberate, unhurried movement that was simply how he moved, and he sat, and he looked at Hargrove and then at Webb, and his face was the careful, contained face he wore when something mattered enough to be cautious with. Webb walked him through the ranch's history. Through his first wife, Clara Silas said her name trank without flinching, though Adeline saw what it cost in the very slight tightening around his eyes. Through the deaths in 1871. Through the years that followed. Webb did not ask him to describe his grief. He asked him to describe his work, what he'd done, year by year, to build the ranch back into something functional. He asked about the complaint from 1872 and let Silas explain it in his own words. A man in a saloon made statements about my wife's death that were untrue and I lost my temper. Once, 14 years ago, he asked about the 3 missing months. Silas was quiet for a moment. After my wife and daughter died, he said, there was a period when I was not managing well. I didn't go into town. I kept to the ranch. I don't have a record from that period because I wasn't doing anything except trying to get through it. He paused. I got through it. That took about 3 months. After that, I worked. Did you seek help during that period? Webb asked. I had a ranch hand at the time named Pete Aldis, who stayed on when he could have left. He's dead now, so he can't speak to it. But he stayed. Another pause. That's the help I had. And since that period, Webb said, have you had any recurrence of those difficulties? No. Any legal trouble of any kind? No. Can you describe in your own words the household as it exists today? Silas looked at the room for a moment. Not at Orson, not at Hargrove. At a point slightly above the level of the people in it, the way a man looks when he is choosing words carefully because the words matter. I advertised for a practical wife, he said. I got Adeline. I also got Tessa and Lucy, which I didn't know was part of the arrangement and which I was not glad about initially. He let that sit. What I know now is that my ranch runs better than it has in 10 years, because Adeline found errors in my accounts that I wouldn't have found on my own. What I know is that Tessa has more aptitude for this land than most grown men I've worked with. What I know is that Lucy has named 11 of my chickens, and I know all their names because she told me enough times that they stuck. He stopped. What I know is that the ranch is not empty anymore, and I had not understood until it wasn't how much that cost me. Hargrove was writing something. Pruitt was writing something. Adeline was not writing anything because her hands were in her lap, and she was keeping them very still. Pruitt's cross-examination was precise and methodical. He asked about the timeline of the marriage. He noted that Silas had known Adeline for under 2 weeks before the wedding. He asked whether Silas had been aware of the full circumstances of her departure from St. Louis. He asked whether Silas had any prior experience raising children. He asked about the adoption petition and whether the timing filed after Orson Vane's letter arrived, not before, didn't suggest it was reactive rather than genuine. Silas answered each question the way he did everything, without hurry and without ornamentation. I had known her less than 2 weeks, he agreed. I had known my first wife for 3 years before we married, and I couldn't stop it. Time is not the measure of these things. Pruitt moved past that quickly. On the question of the adoption's timing, I filed the petition when I understood it was necessary, Silas said. The reason it was necessary was Orson Vane's letter. But the reason I was willing to file it was everything that came before the letter. Pruitt had no follow-up question, which was, Adeline thought, a choice. When Silas stepped down, Webb called Adeline. She had been waiting for this and had been managing the waiting for 3 weeks and was now simply in it, which was in some ways easier. She sat in the chair and looked at Webb and was aware of Hargrove's attention and Pruitt's and Orson's, and she focused on Webb and let the rest be peripheral. Webb asked her about St. Louis. She told him about her husband's illness and death. She told him about the account she had managed. She told him about accounts she had managed. She told him about Orson's Asmuchenkleepy and what that had been like, the reasonable language that surrounded unreasonable access, the opinions that expanded past business into household, into children, into her own time and movement. She did not editorialize. She described. She was specific, and specific was more devastating than dramatic. She told him about the night she decided to leave. Webb asked her to describe it. She said, I put my daughters to bed, and I locked our door with a chair, and I lay awake until 2 in the morning, and then I got up and packed what we could carry. She said I had $11 and a return letter from a man in Wyoming who had advertised for a wife, and who I had written to without telling him about the girls. She said I knew what I was doing was not entirely honest. I did it because I had looked at what honest was costing my daughters, and I decided that protecting them was more important than my own integrity in that moment. She paused. She looked at Hargrove directly. I would make the same choice again, she said. I want the court to know that clearly. I would do it again. Hargrove's face showed nothing particular. Webb asked about the months at the ranch. She described them accurately and without embellishment, the work, the accounts, the marriage, the household as it had become. She described Silas with Tessa. She described the night with Lucy and the warm milk. She did not dress any of it up. Then Pruitt rose. He was careful with her. Most of its windows were dark. More careful than she'd expected. He'd apparently learned from Silas's testimony that plain witnesses don't improve under pressure, they just become plainer. He focused on the deception in the letters. He asked her to, for the record, that she had deliberately withheld information about her children. She confirmed it. He asked whether she had also withheld information about Orson Vane. She said yes. He asked whether Silas Crowley had therefore made his decisions, including the decision to marry her, without complete information. He made them with the information I gave him, she said, and with everything he observed over weeks of living in close proximity to my daughters and me. He is not a man who decides things without looking carefully first. Pruitt moved on. He asked whether she believed Orson Vane posed a genuine danger to her daughters. She looked at him directly. Yes. On what basis? On the basis of what I observed over 14 months in the same house. She kept her voice level. On the basis of the way he watched my daughters. On the basis of the way he managed access to them, who could visit, how long, whether I was present. On the basis of a night when I heard him in the hall outside, the room where my daughters slept, and when I opened the door he was standing there, and he looked at me and smiled, and said he'd heard a noise and was checking. She paused. On the basis that I have been a woman in the world long enough to know the difference between concern and something else. The room was very quiet. Pruitt said, that is your interpretation of events. Yes, she said, it is. He had no further questions. Webb called Tessa last. She walked to the witness chair with the fence post steadiness she'd described in the garden, and she sat, and she looked at Webb with the focused attention she brought to everything she considered worth understanding. Webb was direct with her and did not talk down to her, which Adeline suspected was the correct approach, because Tessa's face would have shown her response to being talked down to, and it would not have helped. He asked her to describe her life in St. Louis in the last year. She did. She was specific in the way her mother was specific: dates, incidents, what was said, and by whom. She described Orson's visits to the house. She described the changes in what they were allowed to do, where they were allowed to go. She described the night with the locked door, not the same night Adeline had described, a different one, 3 months earlier, and the specific different detail landed in the room with the weight of pattern rather than incident. Then she described Wyoming. She didn't romanticize it. She said it was hard and we didn't know anyone, and Silas didn't want us there. She said, I didn't know if my mother had made a mistake. She said, but then he taught me how to check a fence post, and I got 2 of them wrong, and he let me do it over, and I understood something about what this place was going to be. She said, nobody had let me do something wrong and do it over before. Everyone either did it for me or told me I'd failed. He let me fail and then keep going. Hargrove was watching her steadily. Then Pruitt rose. He was, as Webb had warned, methodical. He questioned the reliability of her memory. He suggested, with careful indirection, that a 13-year-old observing adult interactions might misunderstand what she saw. He asked whether her mother had ever discussed Orson Vane's behavior with her in explicit terms. Tessa said yes after they left. Pruitt suggested that her mother's framing might have shaped how Tessa remembered events. Tessa looked at him with the specific expression she had given Silas on the subject of chickens not hostile, but entirely direct. I was there, she said. I didn't need someone to explain it to me after. I knew what I felt when he was in the room. I knew why I pushed the chair against the door at night. She paused. I'm 13, I'm not 6. Pruitt tried a different angle. He asked whether she liked living at Crowley Ranch. Yes. Isn't it possible that because you prefer your current situation, your recollection of your previous one is shaped by that preference? Tessa was quiet for a moment. I didn't say I was afraid of Orson because I wanted to leave, she said. I wanted to leave because I was afraid of Orson. She looked at Pruitt steadily. That's the order. Pruitt said he had no further questions, and he said it in the tone of a man who has not found what he was looking for, and Adeline pressed both hands flat on her knees under the table and breathed through her nose. Tessa walked back to her seat. She sat beside Silas. He did not say anything to her. He looked at the table in front of him, and after a moment he put his hand down next to hers, briefly not holding it, just next to it, and then moved it away. Tessa looked at the front of the room and said nothing, and was visibly not crying. Neither was Adeline, which cost her something. Then came the moment she had not planned for. Webb was beginning his closing argument when the courthouse door opened. It opened with a particular unhurried creak of a door, opened by someone who does not consider themselves an interruption, and a woman came in middle-aged, traveling clothes, clearly arrived from somewhere recently and recently enough that she still had the look of a person's assembling herself after a long journey. Webb stopped. Hargrove looked at the door. The woman said, I apologize, Your Honor. My name is Clara Fitch. I have come from St. Louis's. I was told there was a hearing today concerning the Marlowe children. She held up a document. I have a written statement, and I am prepared to give testimony, if the court will permit it. Adeline felt the air go out of her lungs. Pruitt was on his feet immediately. He objected to the late arrival. He objected to the procedural irregularity. He objected in the smooth, forceful voice of a man who has used procedural objections as weapons for 30 years to the admission of any testimony from a witness not previously listed. Hargrove listened to all of it. Then he said, Mr. Pruitt, I will hear the witness. You may cross-examine. Sit down. Clara Fitch's testimony took 40 minutes. She was a careful, measured woman who said things once, and said them clearly, and what she said was this. She had lived 2 houses from the Marlowe home. For 9 years she had known Adeline Marlowe as a neighbor and a friend. She had watched if its windows were dark. She had watched Orson Vane in the period following his brother's death. She had seen things that had troubled her enough to confide in her husband, and her husband had told her to stay out of it, and she had until she received Adeline's second letter and understood that staying out of it was no longer something she could live with. She described what she had seen. She was specific. She was the 3rd specific witness in a row, who had described specific things with specific dates, and the accumulation of specificity in the room was doing something to the air. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the steady weight of truth told plainly, which is heavier than most people expect. Pruitt's cross-examination of Clara was not gentle. He pressed her on why she had waited, why she hadn't spoken to anyone at the time, whether her friendship with Adeline made her account unreliable. Clara said, I waited because I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. And yes, she is my friend, and I would expect that a friend who had seen what I've seen would speak up. I would hope anyone would. When Clara stepped down, Hargrove called for closing arguments. Pruitt's closing was skilled and organized, and was fundamentally arguing that instability was instability regardless of its origins, that blood relations and established means were preferable to a recently formed household in a territory, that the court should err toward caution in matters concerning children. Webb's closing was shorter. He said, the children are healthy. They are settled. They are in a home where they are known and taught and allowed to fail and try again. The evidence before this court is not of a reckless mother and an unknown. Man, it is of 2 people who have built something real in difficult circumstances, and 2 girls who have flourished in it. The relevant question is not whether this family was formed under ideal conditions. No family is. The question is whether it is a good one. Webb said, the evidence suggests that it is. Hargrove said he would recess for deliberation. The hall outside the courtroom had a bench along one wall, and they sat on it, Adeline and Silas and the girls, and nobody said much. Lucy leaned against Adeline's side, with her eyes open, watching the hallway. Tessa sat with her hands between her knees and stared at the floor. Silas had his elbows on his thighs and his hands loosely clasped. Clara Fitch sat at the far end of the bench and did not insert herself into whatever was happening at the center of it, which was exactly right. Clara, Adeline said. Clara looked at her. Thank you, Adeline said. Clara said, you would have done it for me. They sat in the hall for 55 minutes. Then the bailiff came out and said the judge was ready, and they filed back in. Orson Vane was already at his table. He had not spoken to anyone in the hall during the recess, had sat alone near the window with his composed patient face assembled, and Adeline, walking past him to their table, looked at him once. He met her gaze with the certainty of a man who had always expected to win, the certainty of a man for whom winning was simply the correct order of things. She looked away from him. She sat down. She put her hand in her lap, and Silence's hand came down next to hers on the bench between them, not holding, just present, and she pressed the back of her fingers against the back of his and held them there. Hargrove came in. They stood. He sat. They sat. He looked at his papers for a moment. Then he looked up. I have considered the petition for guardianship filed by Orson Vane, he said, and the petition for adoption filed by Silas Crowley. I have considered the testimony presented by both parties and by witnesses for both parties. He paused. The law in this territory concerning the welfare of minors directs the court to consider above all other factors the best interests of the children in question. The room was absolutely still. It is clear to this court, he said, that the Crowley household represents a settled, functioning home in which both Tessa and Lucy Marlowe have been provided with stability, education in practical skills, and the consistent care of both a mother and a stepfather who have demonstrated commitment to their welfare. He paused. It is further clear that the testimony of Tessa Marlowe, which this court found credible in substance and delivery, raises concerns regarding the petitioner's household that cannot be overlooked. Adeline felt Silas's hand against hers. The petition for guardianship filed by Orson Vane is denied. She heard Pruitt's pen stop moving. Hargrove continued. Regarding the adoption petition filed by Silas Crowley, this court finds that the petitions meet the legal requirements of this territory and that the circumstances of the household support its approval. He looked directly at their table. The petition for adoption is granted. Tessa and Lucy Marlowe are legally entered into the record as Tessa and Lucy Crowley, daughters of Silas and Adeline Crowley. The sound that came out of Lucy was not words. It was the sound of a small body absorbing something too large for words, which came out as a single sharp intake of breath, and then both her arms around her mother's waist and her face pressed hard against Adeline's arm. Tessa sat very still. Adeline looked at Silas. His jaw was working, just slightly, the way it did when he was holding something tightly enough that the effort showed in exactly one place and nowhere else. He looked back at her. She was going to say something. She had no idea what. Then Orson Vane stood up. He did not have permission to speak. Pruitt put a hand on his arm, and he shook it off with a sharpness that was the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she had ever seen him do. And he looked at Hargrove, and then he looked at Adeline across the room, and his face finally did something real. The patience fractured. The careful warmth dissolved, and what was underneath it was not rage exactly. It was something smaller and uglier than rage. It was the face of a man who has arranged the world to reflect his own importance, and is watching the arrangement fail. He said, "This is not finished." His voice was not loud. It was controlled. But the control was the visible kind now, the kind you can see the effort of. Hargrove looked at him with the level attention of a man who has seen this moment many times. "Mr. Vane," he said, "this hearing is finished. If you have legal grounds for appeal, Mr. Pruitt will advise you. If you do not, I suggest you conduct yourself with the dignity appropriate to this court." A pause. "Do you understand me?" A long moment. Then Orson sat down. Pruitt was speaking to him in a low voice. Orson was looking at the table. The mask was not back yet, and the absence of it was in some ways more disturbing than the mask had been, because it was the first clear look at what was underneath. Tessa was watching him. She watched him the way she watched things she was assessing steadily, without expression, filing away what she saw. Then she turned forward and looked at the front of the room, and Adeline saw her exhale, long and slow, like putting something down that she'd been carrying a long time. They walked out of the courthouse into the November air, which was sharp and cold and absolutely real. Clara Fitch embraced Adeline in the way of women who do not often embrace and mean it completely when they do. Webb shook everyone's hands and said he would have the formal paperwork filed before end of week. He shook Tessa's hand separately and said, "You were the best witness in that room today." And Tessa said, "I know," and then apparently decided that sounded wrong and said, "Thank you," and Webb said, "I meant it as a compliment, and I'm glad you took it as one." Lucy had Silas by the hand. She had simply taken it, somewhere between standing up from the bench and walking out of the courtroom, with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had decided something and was acting on it. Silas was looking at the street ahead of them with his particular forward-directed look, but his hand was wrapped around hers. They walked to the wagon. Lucy said, "Are you our papa now?" Silas put her up on the wagon seat and said, "The papers say so." "What do you say?" He settled her against the bench and looked at her for a moment with the specific look she had always been able to get from him, the look that was unguarded in spite of itself. "I say you've got a home," he said, "and I'm the man in it." Lucy considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's good enough," she said, "for now." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, short and self-aware, and not quite all the way out, and climbed up to take the reins. Adeline and Tessa were already in the back. Adeline had her arm around her older daughter's shoulders, and Tessa was leaning in the way she rarely allowed herself to lean into things not collapsed, just resting, the way a person rests when they've finished something hard. Clara's wagon was moving away down the street. The courthouse was behind them. Silas drove. The road home was the same road they'd driven in on that morning, the same mountains, the same October-stripped country, the same pale November sky. But it held itself differently now, or she did. The mountains did not know or care about the courthouse or the hearing or what Hargrove had put on paper. The land was just the land. But she looked at it, going home, and she knew what it was. She knew who was in the wagon with her and what they'd come through and what was on the other side of it. That was enough. That was more than enough. "About 2 miles from the ranch," Silas said without turning around Lucy. "The names of all 11 chickens." Lucy sat up straight with the expression of someone finally being given the floor on an important subject. "Marjorie, Biscuit, Old Agnes, New Agnes, Captain, the one Tessa calls the Navigator, but I call Harriet, Spot, Big Red, Little Red, and Millicent," Tessa said. "Millicent, because she acts like one." "That's 11, Silas said. "I know," Lucy said happily. "I've been telling you." The wagon moved on down the road. The ranch came into view ahead, the fences Tessa had helped repair, the garden Adeline had restored, the barn, the cabin, the curtains in the window that had been there since someone else's time and had stayed through everything since. Home. Not perfect. Not easy. Not anything like what any of them had planned. But home. The chickens were fed before anyone said a word about what had happened. That was the thing about ranch life that Adeline had not fully understood when she'd arrived. It did not pause for significant events. The morning after the hearing, the animals still needed water, the stove still needed wood, and the frost that had settled overnight on the pasture grass did not care at all that a judge in Caldwell had, the previous afternoon, signed his name to a piece of paper that changed everything. Silas was up at his usual time. Adeline heard him before dawn, heard the familiar pattern of his movement through the house, and she lay still for a moment in the dark and let herself feel the specific quality of a morning that was different from all the mornings before it without looking any different at all. Then she got up and made coffee. They did not talk much that morning. There was a kind of quiet between them that was not the cautious quiet of the early weeks, not the quiet of two people managing the distance between themselves, but the quieter quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to describe it to know what it was. Silas drank his coffee. Adeline cooked. Tessa came out early, which was not unusual for her anymore, and helped without being asked, which had also stopped being unusual. Lucy slept until the smell of food found her, which was entirely usual and always would be. It was the most ordinary morning they'd had, and it was, without question, the best one. The weeks that followed the hearing had a different texture than the weeks before it. Not easier, exactly. The ranch work did not become less demanding because they'd won a legal case, and December was coming in hard that year, the cold arriving earlier than Silas could remember it, pressing down from the north with the kind of intent that made you check your supply stores twice. But there was something in the household that had loosened. Some held breath released. Adeline noticed it first in Lucy, who had always been resilient in the way of young children, but who now moved through the house with a settledness that had not been there before, not the careful, watchful stillness of a child who has learned to monitor the atmosphere, but genuine ease, the ease of a person who knows they are not leaving. She noticed it in Tessa differently. Tessa did not do ease. Tessa did competence, and what changed in her after the hearing was that the competence stopped having an edge of urgency to it, stopped feeling like something she was performing to justify her presence. She worked the ranch with Silas in the afternoons with the same focus she'd always brought, but there was something settled underneath it now, something that didn't need to prove itself. Silas noticed it too. He said nothing. Directly. He never said much directly about anything that moved him. But one evening in early December, coming in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen where Tessa was showing Lucy something in one of the books Soms Webb had recommended for her studies, and he stood there for a moment with his coat still on and his expression entirely unguarded in the way it only got when he didn't know he was being watched. Adeline was watching from the other side of the room. He caught her eye. Something passed between them, acknowledgement maybe, or just the shared recognition of what they were looking at. Then he took off his coat and sat down and asked Lucy what she was reading, and the evening went on. That was the thing nobody told you about building a family out of wreckage. The moments that mattered most were never the dramatic ones. They were the doorway moments, the coat removal moments, the asking about the book moments. Adeline had spent years waiting for the large, significant thing to save her. First in her marriage, then in the escape west, then in the courtroom. What she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who'd had to relearn most things she thought she knew, was that the large, significant thing was always assembled from small ones. Always, without exception. December brought 3 things of consequence. The first was a letter from Harlan Dace's lawyer conceding the Eastern property line dispute. Webb had apparently sent a copy of the adoption paperwork to Dace's attorney, with a brief note about the Crowley household's legal standing, and the judge's recent ruling on character. Adeline did not know the specifics, because Webb delivered the news in the elliptical manner of a lawyer who understood that the how of a thing was sometimes better left unclear. The 12 acres on the east slope were confirmed as Crowley land. Silas read the letter at the table, set it down, and said nothing. Then he picked it up and read it again. 2 years, he said, not angry, just noting it. And now it's done, Adeline said. He set the letter down for the second time and went back to his food. But she noticed that he ate the rest of the meal at a pace she had not seen from him before, unhurried in a deeper way. The pace of a man who is not, for the first time in a while, running calculations in the back of his mind. She said nothing about it. She just noted it and was glad for it, and refilled his coffee when the cup was empty. The second thing was a letter from Clara Fitch. It came in the second week of December, and it was short. Clara was not a woman who wrote long letters, which was perhaps why the ones she did write carried so much weight. She said she was well, and that she hoped the family was settled. She said her husband, who had told her to stay out of it, had nonetheless been proud of her for going to Wyoming, which she thought Adeline would find amusing. She said she had heard, through the network of St. Louis neighbors that functioned like a low-grade telegraph system, that Orson Vane had divested himself of several business interests and moved away, and that no one seemed to know exactly where. Adeline read that part twice, the way she'd read Orson's original letter twice, but in reverse, not absorbing a threat but testing the absence of one, making sure it was real. She showed it to Silas that evening. He read it. He looked at her. Does that settle it for you? Almost, she said honestly. What's the other part? She thought about it. I keep waiting for the other shoe, she said. I've been waiting for it for so long that I'm not sure I know how to stop. He was quiet for a moment. Then I waited for 10 years for something else to go wrong. After Clara and the baby, every season, every winter, I'd wake up some mornings, and the first thought was what's going to be taken this time. He looked at the letter in his hand, then at her. It gets lighter. Not gone, just lighter. She looked at him across the lamplit kitchens, this she had lied her way to and stumbled into, and slowly, without planning or permission, come to love in the specific, profound way that only becomes possible after you have seen in a person's worst years and their daily ordinary and their unguarded doorway moments, and found that you are, all things considered, glad they exist. She had not said any of that to him. She was not certain she was going to, not in those words, because they were not words either of them used. But she thought he knew. The way she thought she knew, about him, what did not quite make it into language. All right, she said. All right, he said. He handed the letter back. The third thing December brought was the blizzard. It came on a Thursday in the third week of the month, and it came fast, the way the worst Wyoming storms came, not a gradual accumulation, but a sudden wall of white moving down from the north that was on them before the sky had fully decided to deliver it. Silas had ridden out that morning to check the line shack on the far north quarter, where he'd been doing winter maintenance, before the serious cold locked everything down. He'd expected to be back by early afternoon. By noon, the snow was coming sideways. Adeline stood at the window and watched it, and told herself he knew this land and he knew this weather, and he had survived 17 Wyoming winters without assistance from anyone. And all of that was true, and none of it stopped her hands from being cold, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Tessa stood beside her. How far is the line shack? Tessa asked. About 4 miles north. Maybe 4.5. He'll wait it out there, Tessa said. He's not going to ride back through this. I know. So he's fine. I know, Adeline said again. Tessa looked at her. But you're going anyway. It was not a question. Adeline looked at her daughter. At 13.5 in December, with snow hitting the glass hard enough to rattle the frame, with the expression of a girl who knew her mother well enough to know when the decision had already been made. The fence line goes straight north, Adeline said. If I follow it, I won't get turned around, I know. I helped fix that fence line. Tessa paused. You want me to come? No. She was already moving, already pulling her heavy coat from the hook, already doing the calculation of what she'd need. You stay with Lucy. Keep the stove fed. Don't open the door unless you have to. Mama, she stopped. Tessa looked at her with a directness that was sometimes unsettling in its clarity. Come back, she said, both of you. Not, be careful. Not, are you sure this is wise? Just the demand plainly stated of a daughter who had already lost too many things. Yes, Adeline said, that's the plan. She went out into the white. The fence line was where it was supposed to be, which was the only reason any of what followed was possible. She found the first post by nearly walking into it, got her bearings, and moved post by post with her hand trailing the top wire, leaning into the wind that was trying, with some conviction, to knock her sideways. The snow was not deep, yet the storm was still building, but the visibility was close to nothing, and the cold had the kind of edge that made the inside of your lungs feel brittle. She thought about Silas saying, I waited every season for something else to go wrong. She thought about the way he'd said it, not with self-pity, just with the factual honesty of a man reporting on his own interior weather. She thought about the line shack, which she had been to once, in October, when Silas had shown her the northern boundary of the property in the particular way. He'd started showing her things without ceremony, just walking her through it, as if the act of knowing the land together was itself important. She thought, 4.5 miles is not very far. She thought, it is very far in this. She kept moving. She found him approximately 40 minutes later, which meant she had been lucky with the direction, and the fence line had not veered, and the line shack was exactly where her memory said it was. She could see the faint outline of it through the white. Before she reached it, a dark shape, low against the ground, and light coming through the single, small window that meant the stove inside was going. She opened the door. The warmth hit her like a wall. Silas was on his feet. Before the door was fully open, he'd heard her, or heard something, and his hand was already on the rifle that leaned against the wall, because in a blizzard anything that comes through your door might not be friendly. He registered her in approximately 1 second, and his face went through several things quickly. The last of those things was fury. He crossed the small space in 2 strides and pulled her in by the arm and got the door shut behind her, and then he turned and looked at her, and his voice was absolutely controlled in the way it got when the control was working very hard. What are you doing? The fence line goes straight, she said. Her voice was rougher than she expected. The cold had gotten into it. I couldn't get turned around. You could have. He stopped. Do you understand what this storm is doing? Do you have any idea? You didn't come back, she said. I was waiting it out, which is the rational. I know. She pulled off her coat and her hands were clumsy with cold, and she was already thinking about whether she'd need to worry about her fingers. I know you were waiting it out. I know you were fine. I know it was sensible to stay. She looked at him directly. I still came. He looked at her. The fury was still there, but it had something underneath it now, something that was not fury. Adeline. I've had people leave, she said. I'm done watching people leave if there's anything at all I can do about it. Her voice was even. That's not reasonable, and I know it's not reasonable. I came anyway. He stood in the middle of the small shack looking at her, and the thing underneath the fury was fully visible now. She'd seen that face before, in doorways, in kitchens, in the specific unguarded moments that were the only times she ever saw all of him at once. He said roughly, with the voice of a man who had lost his first wife and his daughter, and 14 years to loneliness, and had finally, reluctantly, found something he could not afford to lose. Don't do this again. I'll do it again every time, she said. So will you. That's what this is. A long moment. Then he crossed the space between them and put both arms around her, which he had not done before. Not like this, not the brief hand at the back, not the fingers next to hers, but fully and without reservation, and she felt him exhale against the top of her head, long and slow, the way Tessa had exhaled on the courthouse bench. She pressed her face against his coat and closed her eyes. They stood like that for a while the blizzard ran itself against the walls of the shack and found no way in. They were stuck through the night. It was not comfortable. The shack was small, and the supplies were minimal, and the wind made sounds that were not quite like any other wind sounds she'd heard, a high, sustained note that felt geological in its indifference. But the stove held, and the wood held, and they talked, really talked, in the way that becomes possible when there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and no way to exit the conversation, which is perhaps the only condition under which certain things finally get said. He told her about Clara. Not the way he'd told Webb, not the careful factual account for legal purposes, but the real version, what she'd been like, what the marriage had been like. And then the night it ended, and the morning after, and the morning after that. He told it slowly, stopping sometimes, and she did not rush him or fill the silence. She just listened. The way someone listens when they understand that the telling is itself something, separate from what is told. She told him about her husband, Edmund. About the man he'd been when she married him, genuinely good, genuinely kind, just not particularly present, the way some men are not present even when they are standing right there. About how his illness had brought him closer to her in some ways and further in others. About the grief that had two layers, the grief for the man dying and the grief for the man she'd never quite had. He would have hated Orson, she said. He knew what Orson was. He just wasn't capable anymore, at the end, of doing anything about it. And you were left to, Silas said. Yes, that's an old story, he said without bitterness, just noting it. It's a very old story, she agreed. They talked about the girls. Silas had things to say about Tessa that surprised her not in their content, but in their specificity. He'd been watching her closely enough to have noticed things Adeline hadn't, that Tessa relaxed when she was doing physical work in a way she never relaxed at rest, that she processed difficulty through motion the same way Silas did. He said he thought she'd be fine, that he meant it as the highest category of assessment. Adeline thought about her daughter resetting fence posts and told him so, and he said, she got them right the second time. Third one was perfect. I didn't tell her, but they were. Why didn't you tell her? He was quiet for a moment, because she knew. She ran her hand down the post, and she knew. Telling her would have been about me, not about her. Adeline looked at him in the dim, warm, storm-surrounded small space and thought, this is who he is. This careful, difficult, profoundly decent man. This was who he had been before grief and loneliness had been laid over him like sediment, and it was who he was still, underneath all of it, waiting to be worth something to someone again. She said, I'm glad it was your advertisement in the Gazette. He looked at her. I wrote 3 versions. The third one was the shortest. That sounds right. I almost didn't send it. I know. She paused. I almost didn't answer it. He looked at the stove for a moment. Then I'm glad you did. For the yes, she said. Me too. The storm broke sometime before 4 in the morning, and they made it back along the fence line in the gray pre-dawn, with the snow up to their knees in places. But the wind gone and the sky beginning to clear, and when the cabin came into view, Adeline saw the lamp already lit in the kitchen window and knew that Tessa had been up keeping watch. She was right. Tessa was at the table with a cold cup of tea and a book she had clearly not been reading, and when the door opened, she stood up and looked at both of them and took one long breath and sat back down. Lucy? Adeline asked. Asleep, Tessa said. She was worried, but I told her you'd be back, and she believed me, so she slept. And you? Tessa looked at her steadily. I believed you too. I was just awake anyway. Adeline went and put her arms around her daughter from behind, and Tessa sat still and let herself be held in the particular way she allowed herself to be held, not leaning into it, but not pulling away either, just tolerating the love with something that was, if you looked carefully, a form of returning it. Silas put wood on the stove and put a pot on, and said nothing for a while, and it was the best kind of nothing. January settled in, and the ranch turned inward the way it always did smaller days, longer nights, whilst the work becoming the kind of work that is mostly endurance. They got through it. Not gracefully, not without friction. There were days that December and January, when the confinement of a small house in bad weather made everyone shorter with each other than they meant to be. When Adeline was sharp about something minor, and Silas retreated into silence for 2 hours, and Lucy cried because the weather made her anxious, and Tessa snapped at Lucy and then felt bad about it. They were a real family, which meant they irritated each other, which meant they also repaired each other, because that is how real families operate, not through an absence of damage, but through the persistent willingness to patch it. She found out she was pregnant in February. She knew, before she was certain in the way women know things before they can prove them a difference in her body. That was not like illness and not like anything else she could name, a particular quality to the mornings that she recognized from 2 times before. She sat with it alone for 10 days, which was perhaps longer than she should have, but she needed the time to decide what she felt, before she had to discuss what she felt. What she felt was complicated. Joy was in there. Genuine, clear, uncomplicated joy at the fact of it. But underneath that was a specific fear she had not anticipated, not for herself, but for Silas. She knew what he carried about childbirth. She knew the weight and shape of it. She'd heard it from his own mouth in the line shack while the blizzard worked at the walls. And she understood, in the precise way she understood most things about him now, that this news would ask him to walk directly into the wound he'd been carrying for 15 years. She told him on a Sunday evening after the girls were in bed. She told him plainly, without softening it, because she had learned that softening things for Silas was both useless and disrespectful. He went very still. She watched him go through it, the sequence of it happening across his face in the specific order it happened. First the shock, which lasted only a second, then something that was joy but immediately complicated by fear, then the fear consolidating into something she could see him actively fighting, and then finally just a man sitting in a kitchen chair looking at his hands. She said nothing. She had said what needed to be said, and now she waited. He was quiet for a long time. "You're healthy," he finally said. Not a question exactly. "Yes, I'm strong and I'm healthy, and this is not the same situation as before." She kept her voice steady. "I know you know that. I know knowing it doesn't fully help." He looked up. "I know. I need you to know that. He stopped. "I've been afraid every winter that something would be taken. And now, I know. It doesn't mean I don't want this." He looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that was nakedly honest in the way he rarely allowed. "I want this. He stopped again, and she waited, and he got there. "I want to not lose anyone else. I want to build something and have it stay." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Then let's build it," she said. "And let's not decide yet how it ends." He turned his hand over and held hers. She felt the grip of it, not the careful, minimal contact of a man managing his distance, but the grip of someone holding something they have decided to hold. "All right," he said. The pregnancy was not easy, and was not supposed to be described as easy. She was tired in ways she had not been tired with the girls, and there were weeks in March and Colt when she found the accounts harder to concentrate on and the mornings harder too, and she did not pretend otherwise. Silas did not hover. Hovering was not in his nature, but he redistributed the work without discussion, which was the practical version of care, which was the kind he was best at. Tessa took on more than her share without complaint. Lucy, who had been told what was happening in an age-appropriate but honest conversation that she had received with great solemnity, decided that her primary responsibility was to inform the chickens, which she did. And the chickens, Silas noted, remained indifferent to the news. "Millicent seemed interested," Lucy said. "Millicent's not interested in anything that isn't scratch feed," Silas said. She looked interested. She looked like a chicken. You're not objective about Millicent, Lucy said. You've never liked her. I like all the chickens equally. You don't, Lucy said, with the serene certainty of someone who has studied the subject. You have a soft spot for Biscuit. Everyone can see it. Silas opened his mouth and then apparently could not find a refutation because Biscuit had in fact received more grain than the others on multiple documented occasions. Adeline, listening from across the room with both hands resting on the shape of what was coming, felt something that she decided, on reflection, was just happiness, not the dramatic, earned against all odds version she'd been told to expect. Just ordinary happiness, domestic and imperfect and completely real. In May, a letter came from Webb. She recognized his handwriting and opened it, expecting something administrative, a follow-up on the adoption paperwork, some detail that needed addressing. Instead, it was 2 paragraphs, and it changed the last remaining thing. Orson Vane had been arrested in Denver, Colorado. Webb had received the information through his legal contacts and had thought she would want to know promptly. The charge was fraud, a scheme involving business partners he had apparently been defrauding for several years before the exposure caught up with him. Webb said the charges were serious enough that Orson's legal and financial resources were now substantially occupied by his own defense, and that in Webb's professional opinion, the Crowley family was unlikely to face any future action from that quarter. She read it at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a while. Then she walked outside and stood by the south fence where the blue wildflowers came up in spring, the ones Lucy had noticed her first week, the ones she'd told Adeline about, the ones she'd decided Silas must like where they were. They were coming up now, small and very blue against the early May grass, and the mountains were visible in the clear morning air with the particular sharp clarity that only came when the world had been washed by recent weather. She had run from St. Louis with $11 and 2 daughters and a desperate lie. She had arrived at a stranger's door with a dying child and no plan beyond the next hour. She had rebuilt a man's accounts and a dead guard and a marriage that wasn't one until it was, and she had stood in a courtroom and told the truth, and it had been enough barely, exactly. Enough. She had followed a fence line through a blizzard because she decided she was not willing to wait to find out if the person she loved was all right. She was still in many ways the same woman who had packed the trunk in the dark, still impatient, still capable of fear, still imperfect in ways she was learning to live with rather than overcome. But she was standing in the May sun in Wyoming on land that was hers and her daughter's and her husband's and soon would be one more person's, and the thing she felt standing there was not triumph. Triumph is for people who weren't sure they'd win, and she'd never been sure, not once, not entirely. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. She felt like she was home. Silas, when he came around the side of the barn. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, and then at the letter in her hand. He waited. Orson's been arrested, she said. Denver. Fraud. He was quiet for a moment. She could not read his face from this angle, but she heard him exhale one long, deliberate breath, the kind that releases something that has been held a long time. Then it's done, he said. It's done. He came and stood beside her at the fence. Not touching, they were both people who had arrived at affection sideways and still operated that way. Contact chosen rather than assumed, but close enough. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. The morning was very still. Wren, she said. He looked at her. If it's a girl, she said. I was thinking Wren. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to anything that mattered. Wren Crowley, he said. Yes. He looked back at the mountains. That's a good name. I thought so. From inside the house, they heard Lucy's voice loud, declarative, apparently in the middle of an explanation that Tessa was tolerating with visible patience. The sound of it floated out through the open window and across the yard, and it was so ordinary, so completely ordinary, that it was almost too much. Tessa's going to need her own horse, Silas said. If she's going to be useful on the far pastures this summer, she'll be very pleased to hear that. Don't tell her I said it like that. How should I tell her? Tell her she's earned it. He paused. Because she has. Adeline smiled. She did not try to prevent it or moderate it. He glanced at her sideways and looked away quickly, in the manner of a man who has noticed something and is pretending he hasn't, and she loved him for it, specifically and completely. Not despite the pretending, but including it, because this was who he was. This careful, Private, decent man who expressed love through property rights and warm milk and post-check fence lines and a horse for a 13-year-old who had earned it. She would have chosen him. If she'd known from the beginning exactly how it would go, she would have chosen all of it. Wren Crowley was born on a September morning, 3 years to the month from the day the stagecoach had broken down on a Wyoming road and Adeline had turned north toward a stranger's ranch with nothing to offer but work and need and the specific, terrifying honesty of a woman who has run out of options. She arrived with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting long enough, and she arrived healthy, and she cried the way all new people cry with the full conviction of someone discovering that the world is louder and colder than they'd been led to expect. Silas was there. He had been there through all of it, quietly and without fuss, in the way he was present for things that mattered not theatrically, not performing his concern, just there. When it was over and the baby was in Adeline's arms, red-faced and decisive, he came and looked at her daughter for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it did, several things at once, none of them completely expressible, the grief and the love and the fear and the enormous terrifying fact of a new life next to his. He put one finger in the baby's hand. Wren Crowley, who was approximately 4 minutes old and had no agenda beyond existing, grabbed it with the absolute conviction of someone claiming what was theirs. He looked at the grip. He looked at the small face. He did not say anything for a long moment then. Very quietly, "Hello, Wren." Tessa was in the doorway. She had been in and out all morning, unable to maintain her usual composure about it, hovering in the way she never usually hovered. Lucy was beside her, pressed against her sister's arm, and her face was entirely open in the specific way. Only Lucy's face opened, no calculation, no management, just the pure response of a child who sees something wonderful. "Can I hold her?" Lucy asked. "When can I hold her? Is she staying?" "She's staying," Tessa said. "Forever?" "Forever," Tessa said, with the authority of someone who had once been asked if they were scared, and said no, and meant it. Lucy looked at the baby with the expression of someone receiving a gift they had not known they were hoping for. She looked at Silas, then at her mother, then back at the baby. "She has Mama's nose," Lucy said. "She has a nose," Silas said. "That's the extent of what I can determine at this point. It's Mama's nose, I can tell." Lucy was already moving forward. "She needs to know my name. Tessa, she needs to know my name right away, because I'm going to be very important to her." "She's 4 minutes old," Tessa said. "That's not too young to know your name." "Lucy." Silas held out his free arm, the one Wren wasn't currently anchored to, and Lucy came to him without hesitation, which was still, even now, something Adeline felt in her sternum every time it happened. He let her look at the baby up close, let her talk at the baby in her particular earnest way, and he looked at Adeline over her head. She looked back. They had not made promises to each other, not the romantic kind, not in words. What they had made was more durable than promises. They had made choices, repeatedly, in the specific circumstances that reveal what people are actually made of. They had chosen each other in courtrooms and blizzards and ordinary February mornings, and all the small daily acts of building something worth having. This was the result. 4 children, 1 born and 3 claimed, in a house that smelled like coffee and wood smoke and hay, brought in from Boots, on land that was finally uncontested and prosperous, in a life that was nothing like anything either of them had planned, and exactly what they had needed. Years later, when Tessa was running the North Pasture, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted she belonged there, and Lucy had filled every room in the house with stories and noise, and the rotating cast of animals she considered worth knowing, and Wren had grown into a girl who had her mother's precision and her father's stubbornness in a combination that was going to be someone else's problem. Eventually, Adeline would sometimes try to identify the moment it had become real. She could never find it. It was never one moment. It was the water Silas had brought without being asked, the dishes on the first morning, the ledger at the kitchen table, the 7 days that became 7 months, that became a life. It was Tessa on a witness stand saying, "I'm 13, I'm not 6. It was Lucy naming 11 chickens and insisting on their individuality. It was a fence line in a blizzard. It was a man putting his finger in his daughter's hand and saying hello. It was all of it, every ordinary and extraordinary piece of it, assembled without plan into the shape of something that held. The thing about families built out of need and desperation and imperfect choices is that they are, in some ways, stronger than the ones built under ideal conditions. Not because suffering is ennobling, it isn't, and she had no patience for that idea. But because people who have chosen each other when they did not have to, who have stayed when leaving was possible, who have built something out of honesty after beginning with a lie, those people know the value of what they have, in a way that people handed things easily do not always know. She was not a perfect woman. She was impatient and occasionally proud, and had deceived a man she came to love, and would make the same choice again. She had asked for 7 days and taken a lifetime. He was not a perfect man. He had closed himself off so completely that love had to come at him sideways for years before he could look at it straight. He was slow to say things and faster to demonstrate them, and still sometimes retreated into himself when the feeling got too large, and she had learned to wait for him to come back out, and he always did. They were exactly imperfect enough to be real. And the ranch that had been empty and silent and slowly failing in Kalin when they arrived was, by the time Wren was old enough to trail after her sisters across the pasture with her own opinions about the chickens, a thriving and known and unmistakably inhabited place. A home. Not because circumstances had finally been kind. Circumstances are rarely kind, and anyone who has lived long enough knows this to their bones. But because 4 people and then 5 had decided, in various desperate and imperfect ways, to stay, to fight, to show up for each other with whatever they had, which was sometimes very little, and to believe that very little was worth the building. It was. It always had been.